Thank you for being here, everybody. I wanted to go over some housekeeping rules before we jump into the content of our day. How we are going to keep connected is through the chat. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, please use the chat. And our DMH, our UCLA, and our LACO partners will be very attentive to the chat and will be answering your questions. Please refrain from using the Q&A feature of the Zoom because we are going to save that only for the panelists. So when the panelists are done, we're going to have a Q&A section, and I will prompt you. And at that time, if you have questions for the panelists, you can enter it there. So this symposium today, it will consist of a 4-part series. Today is day 1, and the focus is on racial justice and educational equity. You will hear valuable information from professionals, school leadership, and youth on how to build a more race-conscious and equitable educational system. Thank you for folks that participated on the icebreaker. I wanted to take a minute just to say what I'm grateful for today. I'm grateful for great partnerships. This symposium would not be possible without the partnership of LACO and UCLA and DMH. And Dr. Duardo 3 years ago when they wanted to bring trauma-informed care to the school community. So they brought their team along, Gita Murthy, our executive consultant, Marcela Ramirez, and Arturo Valdez from Dr. Duardo's team, and they brought us along. And it's been a tradition that we started 3 years ago, and while we can't be together face-to-face, it's great we have technology and we can be here and still share the same passion we have for schools and our students and our educators. And I have to start off also by saying thank you to the committee that helped organize this. From LACO, Jose and Dottie and the IT tech crew, thank you so much. From UCLA, Laura, thanks for being there and providing guidance for us. And from the DMH team, I want to say thank you to Rebecca and Claudia and Dr. Bear, our educational consultant, and all the team members that helped put this series together. Without them, this would not be possible, so thank you. So we're here today, and we know that there's a lot that has happened since early March with the pandemic. The pandemic has really revealed that there are certain areas in our educational system that we really need to look at. Systemic racism, many kids are disproportionately impacted. Our Black, Indigenous, people of color are impacted by so many things from the pandemic. From job loss to the digital divide, students from upper, middle, and lower income students, we see that there's a huge disparity. And the well-being of our teachers, of our educators, of parents, our students, we're asking you to do so much more. And our levels of stress, our anxiety, grief and loss, isolation, many of us are suffering alone. And so it's important to talk about well-being. It's important to talk about systemic racism. And many of these things we usually don't want to talk about, right? It makes us very uncomfortable, but it's important to kind of roll up our sleeves and have these very difficult conversations for the sake of our students, our children, our youth, our next generation. I would like to share with you something that Dr. Sherin shares and kind of introduced to the department, and that has stayed with me, and is this notion of none of us are well until all of us are well. So what does that mean for me? For me, the word that stands out is the word care. And I want you to think about for the teachers, for parents, holding your students, your child in your hand. Think about the word care. What does that mean to you? For me, care means C stands for connection. Especially right now when people are isolated and alone, it's important to connect when you see somebody is suffering. the connection has to be authentic, right? So when you reach out and connect, it has to come from your heart. R is for respect. Sometimes the people you connect with, the people you see suffering, may not be people that you hold the same belief systems with, but you have to be respectful. So the connection has to be respectful and authentic. And E is encouraging. You have to instill hope nowadays when you connect with people. So authentic respect and encouragement. And because I'm amongst educators, I have to put in educate, because when we hold our students in our hand and we connect with them in an authentic and respectful manner, and we encourage them and give them hope, they are going to move from lower parts of their brain to the higher parts of their brain when they're ready to learn and soak up all the knowledge you have to give. So I leave you with this. I want you to think about what this word means to you. And with that, I am going to introduce our first speaker. He is the director of Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health and has been with us for over 3 years. He's introduced a concept to our system and then to LA County and trickled up to the state, and this concept of prevention, the importance of educating, building awareness, and making sure people get help on the front end instead of suffering alone. And so for that, Dr. Sherin, I thank you for that. And he leads the largest public mental health system in the country, serving the most populous and ethnically diverse county in the nation. He brings to the post the invaluable skills of a psychiatrist and a neurobiologist, and the passion and dedication of a well-being advocate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Sherin. Dr. Sherin, the floor is yours, or the platform's yours.
The platform. Thank you so much, Conchi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start by reflecting on the tunes that started off at least before this event, the Earth, Wind, and Fire. I don't know if other people could hear that, but that flashes me back to 7th grade and the talent show, and really just kind of for me was provided some context for the kids in school now, and kind of what it was like then for me, and what it might be like for others today. And boy, is it different. I'd like to just start by acknowledging some people here, and first I'd like to acknowledge my partner Debra, Duardo, who I did meet about 3.5 years ago. We started around the same time. And I just adore Debra as a human being, and kind of honor her as an educator, and treasure the partnership that we're developing. It's been an absolute joy, and also her team, who obviously has just done a tremendous amount of work. I want to recognize UCLA and the work that we're doing as two public entities. We actually are both part of the state, and we both have to be focused on the public system, and the people who depend upon the public system. And we're doing that at a whole new level. In particular, Catherine Mogul, as well as Dr. Patricia Lester. Most importantly, in terms of acknowledgments, I need to acknowledge my team. And when I was asked about what I'm grateful for, I just said my team, because I'm grateful for you all. And there are many people who are involved in DMH in this work. And I think of two stars. I think about the rising star by the name of Conchi Tate, who's just really kind of shining bright and taking on so much more responsibility, and kind of bringing it every day, and elevating our game. And Conchi, I'm so thankful to you. But when I think about all these people, and I think about LACO, and I think about UCLA, and I think about DMH, I have to think about not a rising star, but a full-on, bright, shining star by the name of Geeta Murthy, who has been, Kanchi called her our executive consultant. I call her the executive consultant because she is the one that has weaved the partnership and done it here and done it really in many other parts of this department. Anyway, lots of thanks. I'm I have a lot of appreciation and love in my heart for you all, and I'm sorry I took so much time, but that's kind of where I am today. We do find ourselves in an incredibly unprecedented time. And I would suggest that while it's challenging and there are many divisions, it is moments like these, it's times like these that catalyze our communities across the county, but really across the country. And that has to happen. We have to collaborate in the face of adversity, become united and empowered and emboldened as people to advocate for everything good. And with respect to this session, justice and rights. We need open dialogue. Dialogue is a part of the solution, as is empathy. As Kanchi said, she kind of preempted this line, but none of us are well until all of us are well. We're a collective. And unless that collective is included and held up and given opportunities, supported and nurtured, none of us at the end of the day are well. And I think that's a silver lining of many things that are happening now with the pandemic, where our interdependence is so critical in terms of how we show love by giving each other space, by wearing masks, by washing our hands, and certainly with the social unrest and our insistence that structural racism be dismantled. Structural racism has a massive impact on our society, and it drives stress. It drives suffering. It drives suffering from mental illness and from signs and symptoms of people who are not doing well. When I think about the kids, and when we think about the kids who are in school, they're experiencing a tremendous amount of stress, loss, grief, and disconnection because of this pandemic and because of the new model. And that has to be considered by all of us every day. And I think in particular, as Kanchi points out, youth of color have much, much more to deal with. And unless we step up and recognize that and identify solutions for equity, that will always be the case. And that's not okay. We have to figure out how to navigate inequitable systems and to provide treatment in a way that is fully equitable. With respect to this conversation, it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I mean, it's uncomfortable for me sometimes, although I'm becoming much more comfortable with it and really kind of getting in front of it and leaning forward in the department and also in the county. We have to have these conversations. We have to have them. We have to be comfortable with them over time. We have to engage them honestly. We have to be tolerant of the fact that different people have different perspectives, and that only by managing to embrace and listen carefully can we become more connected. New ways to connect, new ways to learn, new ways to advocate. As a closing statement, and I say this all the time, with respect to the schools, kids are the engineer. Kids are the trenches. We have to not just listen carefully to the kids. We have to act on what the kids tell us. We have to develop platforms for kids so that they can, in their own way, be safe, have opportunities that they need to flourish, and lead us forward. Unless we listen to the kids, follow their direction as we can, we will never engineer the school systems of the future. Thank you very, very much. I have a lot of hope and feel very confident about where we're going. I think we need to be patient, resilient, and strong in the face of this adversity.
Thank you, Dr. Sherin. It is equally an honor to introduce our next speaker, an educational leader who has dedicated her career to ensure that all students receive an education in a safe, caring environment, and that every student is college prepared and career ready. Named Los Angeles County Superintendent of Schools in 2016, she provides leadership and support for the top administrators in the county's 80 districts, serving 1.5 million students. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Debra Duardo. Dr. Duardo.
Good morning, and thank you, Conchi, for your wonderful introduction. I too am filled with gratitude. I put in the chat box, I am grateful for Dr. Sherin and his team, and of course my team that have been working now for a few years together and really trying to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students and families more holistically. So I want to appreciate all of the people involved in this true partnerships. Of course, I want to thank UCLA. I want to thank my team, specifically my deputy, who we're missing all of his jokes, but he'll be here next time, Arturo Valdez, Maricela Ramirez, Jose Gonzalez, and I have to thank Gita as well, who has just been amazing at keeping us all together and keeping us on task. So thank you. Welcome to everyone for being here. This is our third annual symposium, and there couldn't be a more important time than to address racial justice and equity in education. You know, we have definitely seen through this pandemic, it has put a spotlight on the disparities of our children of color, poor children, children with disabilities, are most vulnerable. We have definitely seen that they have been impacted in so much of a harsher way than many others. So it's so important that we're having these conversations, that we're coming together and we're coming up with solutions on how we can address racial injustice and ensure equity throughout not only our schools, our county, our country. We have a lot of work to do. And it starts with really having conversations about breaking the cycle of poverty and systemic racism. And those are not easy conversations to have, and they do make people uncomfortable. And it is painful sometimes to engage in these conversations, but it is so necessary that we have these conversations and that we move forward. Because what we want and what we know actually is that systemic racism started way before this pandemic. And it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take time for us to make the gains that we need to make to ensure that everyone is well, as Dr. Sherin said. So I'm really grateful to be here. You know, it's almost like the whole partnership idea, our community schools framework, couldn't have come at a better time. We started this in January of 2019, and now we're in year 2 of this. And I'll tell you, our 15 districts that are in the poorest communities and serving the most vulnerable families have so much appreciated us being there in order to be able to provide additional support. You know, and this started with just a few people coming together and believing in this. It was Dr. Sherin, it was other department heads in the county, and it was our philanthropists, a few that took a risk and said, we really need to invest in this, as well as our board of supervisors that took a chance on investing in this idea of partnerships and leveraging our resources and making sure that we're not duplicating efforts, but that we're working together hand in hand to make sure we're serving our families, as Conchi said so well, where they're at. Because that's where we need to be, and absolutely making sure we're serving our most vulnerable youth. COVID-19 has definitely demonstrated how much families and students rely on services through schools and through these partnerships in order for them to access their instructional program. You know, we need to meet their basic needs. We need to make sure that they are well physically, emotionally, that they have housing, that they have health care, that they are in a safe environment where they can thrive and learn. And that's the foundation that they need in order to be able to function well in school. So we know that schools can be the lead, as other community organizations need to come together and coordinate our efforts to make sure we're serving our families well. So we got a lot of work to do. We need to make sure that we stay focused. I'm really thankful that this is year 2 and that we are going to continue to thrive. We're going to make sure we continue to provide food and devices and internet connectivity and mental health services, and that we're making sure that our children and families are safe, and that we're listening to them, that we're allowing them, we're empowering them to tell us what they need, when they need it, and how we can best support them. And it's LACO's goal to expand this model so that it's countywide and that all schools have access to these services and supports. And we're really grateful to be here with all of you. And again, I just want to thank everyone. There couldn't be a better time for us to do this work. We're doing it together, we're learning together, and we're going to grow together. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duardo. Thank you, Dr. Sherin and Dr. Duardo, for your leadership and really making it okay for us to have these conversations. And yes, they're uncomfortable, but we have to do it for our kiddos, right? So thank you for your leadership. With that, I want to introduce our first panel presentation titled Racial Justice and Education Equity. Our speakers will speak to the history of our education system and how the current climate has highlighted the inequities and injustice that exist within education. Not only to highlight, but to have meaningful dialogue and on how we can create change. I am delighted to introduce our moderator. He is an influential and nationally recognized scholar focused on closing the achievement gap for young men of color and other culturally diverse students in urban schools. Recently, he and his team have led virtual conversations around race and equity in education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard, who will introduce his panel of experts. Welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thank you so much, Conchi. It is my sincere honor and privilege to be here this morning and to be part of this important conversation. I want to also mention the importance of these partnerships and why they matter and why they're important and why they have to be an ongoing part of how we work towards identifying viable solutions. I want to reinforce what was said earlier, but I think this coming together between the Department of Mental Health, LACO, and UCLA is the type of partnership that is essential to ensuring that we take public entities to address those issues that are affecting the public good. Dr. John Sherin is someone I hold the utmost respect for in terms of his commitment to continue to push on the ways we think about mental health in our county. Same thing can be said for the kind of admiration and deep respect I have for Dr. Duardo, who I've had the good fortune of knowing for a very long time. She's always been a champion of justice, a champion for our children, and a champion for equity in ways that are rare to see among school leaders. Conchi Tate, your leadership and all the other conveners have been really important in putting this together. I want to acknowledge the fabulous team I have with the UCLA Pritzker Center and my colleagues, Audra Langley and Tricia Lester, Todd Frankie, Taylor Dudley, and also Geeta Murthy, who has been a part of this work as well in terms of making sure that we don't drop the ball on this topic. I cannot find at this point a more pressing topic for us to begin to really engage in to talk about how we improve student safety and well-being than to take a hard look around the ways in which race and racism continue to play out in our schools and our society and how we have to be better. And I want to sort of set the stage before I bring our panelists on to say that there has been a lot of discussion in our various spaces of late about how we have to have the courage to have conversations about racial justice, how we have to have the willingness to have the conversations about racial inequity and systemic racism. And I applaud those platitudes around the conversation. But what I hope we don't do is to get comfortable with just having the conversation. Because while I recognize and I acknowledge that having conversations is an important starting point, it cannot be an ending point. And part of what I'm beginning to sort of get a little bit sort of bothered by is that the conversation becomes sort of we've done enough. And that's not enough. Our conversation must translate into action, bottom line. Our conversation must move into dismantling racist practices, racist policies, and racist structures that continue to have a profound impact on young people of color in this county every single day. So our goal today with our panel is to begin to find ways that we move away from the conversation into collective action. Supervisor Mark Willie Thomas was bold enough to put forth a motion that says that LA County would take on an anti-racist approach. That is an important step of action. How do we begin to tackle and dismantle policies, practices, and structures that create the kind of race-related traumas that far too many Black, Indigenous, and people of color face every single day in our county of Los Angeles? I would also argue, and our panelists will, I think, bring this to further fruition, is that we have to begin to sort of name the ways in which we see these different accounts of racial hostility play out, identify some of the root causes, and then take those steps to dismantle it permanently so that they don't rear their ugly heads. I'm still somewhat befuddled when I hear people talk about the fact that they just don't think that our schools and our spaces are racially hostile. Well, if you talk to students, you would find out something very different. If you hear their stories, you would find out something different. If you hear their accounts of how they see and how they experience the ways in which they learn from adults who are supposed to have their best interests at heart, but yet they oftentimes engage in some of these constant racial microaggressions that only begin to erode the confidence and erode the self-esteem and erode the confidence and overall academic ability of our young people. So I want to make sure that this conversation not only stays front and center, but it also moves us into action. I cannot have folks who say, I believe in the importance of us addressing mental health, but then say, but I don't want to address issues around racism. Because for many of our young people, the ways in which their anxiety and depression and anger is manifested is by racism. So we cannot disentangle these. And for many of our young people, they are all intertwined. Too many people have taken the steps to say that we are going to take the steps around mental health, but I don't know if I want to talk about the racism stuff because that's a little bit different. If you're going to go all the way here, go all the way. And I think that we are fortunate today to have some expert panels who are going to take us in a direction to begin to help us begin to unpack the ways in which we can begin to be better around this work. And one of my sort of degrees of gratitude is that as someone who works at UCLA, I have the good fortune of being able to come into contact with a number of amazing scholars and thinkers and doers who are in the trenches, who are fighting, thinking, researching, advocating every single day around these issues in a real robust way. So I'm not going to say much more because I think it's time for these amazing scholars to talk about their work and how their work is important in this pivotal moment. So I want to start off with Kendrick Watson, Dr. Kendrick Watson. I'm not going to go through all the formal introductions around Dr. Watson because I've had the good fortune of knowing Dr. Watson for close to a decade. And I will say you will not find very many individuals who are more passionate, who are more informed, who are more unapologetic in their advocacy, in their research around issues tied to Black people, Black culture, Black life, Black history. I can tell you that I've sat in many a conversation with Dr. Watson and I've come away informed, transformed, and feeling like I'm ready to do more. So I'm going to welcome Dr. Kendrick Watson to take the first approach, take the first part of our panel. And then after he concludes with his presentations, I'll move on to the introduction of our second two panelists from there. Dr. Watson, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Howard. I appreciate the kind and generous and humbling introduction. I am happy to be here with you all and share some perspective about this reality of wellness, as we'll get into further in the conversation today. My research considers the biopsychosocial impact of everyday racism. So I study how everyday racism impacts Black people at the cellular level. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at in the Health and Equity Research Lab up at San Francisco State University in the biology department. And so this concept or conversation about wellness is always on my mind, especially when it relates to our schools. And so I'm going to try to lay out some history and some grounding or perspective about why we might be seeing some of these outcomes in today's world. Because when we look at racial equity, it is true that the realities of the disparities are really coming home to bear on us right now. So folks are very much aware that people are disproportionately suffering, and that seems to correlate with their embodiment as Black people, as Indigenous people, as other folks of color. And I'm going to go to a concept that really comes to us from Judge Robert Lee Carter, who helped work on cases that the NAACP was advocating for. One important case, the Brown versus Board of Education case. And as you see there next to Judge Carter, you see Thurgood Marshall, right? So Carter comes into this conversation now in the 80s after having worked on these landmark cases. And what he said in the 80s about the reality of ongoing injustice, ongoing racism, ongoing outcomes of disparity in our school spaces is that they had really failed in strategy, the NAACP. He said, we erred. We didn't understand then how effective white power could be in preventing full implementation of the law, nor did we realize at the time that the basic barrier to full equality for Blacks was not racial segregation, a symptom, but white supremacy, the disease. And what I love about his framing here is that he's asking us to think about, and he's really reflecting on the failures of strategies to try to address the largest of our everyday, ongoing, historical, structural disparities, the failures of strategies that don't get at the root of the problem, right? And I'm going to ask us to think about how racism, which there's a lot of conversation about right now, racial equity, anti-racist efforts, addressing even frameworks of anti-Black racism. How is that different from anti-Blackness? Well, many folks on this call probably are familiar with Beverly Tatum, and she gave us a definition of racism back in 1997. She said it's a system of advantage that benefits whites at the expense of people of color. And even though I think that there's a deeper definition of racism, I do think that we oftentimes, even when we uplift that definition, fail to listen to when she talks about the relationship. The advantages that are afforded non-people of color in this country are directly correlated to the disadvantages that people of color experience. Those are advantages that are offered because other people don't have them, right? So I'm going to say, we'll put that to the side for now and look at anti-Blackness. And a really great article came out this summer from Kiana Ross, an educational scholar, who said that when we're looking at this reality of what killed George Floyd, right, and it sparked the uprising that we're still in the midst of, that we shouldn't be calling it racism. And even when we're looking at health disparities for COVID that are just devastating our communities, we shouldn't be calling those racism. We should call them what they are, anti-Blackness. And so what she says is anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity. It captures the reality that the kind of violence that saturates Black life is not based on any specific thing a Black person, which is really better described as a person who's been racialized as Black, did. The violence we experience isn't tied to any particular transgression. It's gratuitous. It's unrelenting, right? So that violence of gratuitous and unrelenting anti-Blackness, right? That it helps us understand that society's hatred of Black is also complicated by its need for our existence. So, for example, white people, and we should really describe white people as those who have been racialized as white, because there is nothing biologically natural, correct, or right about that concept of whiteness, right? So people who have been racialized as white, right? The abject humanity of Black people, of Blackness, reinforces whiteness, right? It reinforces white people's humanness, their power and their privilege, whether or not they're aware of it. So Black people are at once despised and also a useful counterpoint for others to measure their humanness against, right? In other words, while one may be experiencing compounding disadvantages, I'm quoting Dr. Ross here, at least they're not Black. And we know this is within all of our communities. The worst that we could be is dark. Regardless of our ethnicity, regardless of how we're coming into this conversation, darkness as a concept is really derided. It's how we describe the worst times in our life. It's how we describe a candidate who we don't think is going to actually win, or if they do, it'd be really surprising. Darkness is hated, and it also provides a useful counterpoint for what it means to be a human. So anti-Blackness is about humanity and comparing human space to a non-human being. And we get this historically, right? When we look historically, chattel slavery in the United States commences in 1619, or in what would become the United States, commences in 1619. It carries through to 1865, right? Now, folks argue, and I would also agree, that slavery never ended. You know, maybe in form, it changed, it transformed, it mutated into racial apartheid and Jim Crow, where Black beingness was stapled so concretely to criminality that people would literally be criminalized and sent back to the plantation for existing in public space, loitering, right? So racial apartheid becomes the status of our country for another 100 years. We've had 55 years of conditional humanity granted through citizenship rights for Black people. Just 55 years with the passing of the major civil rights legislation that I was referring to earlier, okay? Now in that 55 years, we know that the prison population has exploded, right? From around 300,000 in 1965 to now over 3 million, of which Black people and other people of color, Indigenous and brown folks, are disproportionately participants, right? Unwilling participants. So if you look deeper into this reality of how anti-Blackness really is, in Frank Wilderson's term, it provided the genome, the matrix, the genetic matrix for what would become the democracy of the United States. In 1808, a law was passed saying that you could not bring any more enslaved people into the country. They ended the external slave trade in many parts because of the 3/5 compromise, which granted states that had large slave populations to count. For every 5 slaves that an individual earned, you would get 3 compulsory votes in whatever way that your house voted, right? And so this concept of ending the external slave trade really benefited those southern states who had amassed a good amount of enslaved people, right? They wanted a monopoly on that power. So they ended the slave trade, okay? And you had up to that point total, right, 389,000 African people brought into the country between 1619 and 1808. Only 389,000. I say that only because I'm going to compare it to where were we at by 1860, a few years before the Civil War. By 1860, there were 4 million African enslaved people in the United States. We made up about 12% of the population by that point, which is where we are today, right? Prior to the Atlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade began in 652 AD, and that also targeted African people. I think there was 12 to 15 million brought in through the Atlantic slave trade, something like 17 million brought in through the Arab slave trade. So it actually dwarfed the Atlantic slave trade, right? The African population did not increase. The human population has not increased on the continent of Africa since the Arabs decided to go into Africa and start siphoning people out. You got to go back to 384 BCE before you get some concept, the first concept of anti-Blackness, really aspired to by Plato, who was talking about the Ethiops, those he called burnt faces, and said that they were the best kinds of slaves because they had experienced extremities in the climate that they were in. And that same thinking was picked up by Ibn Khaldun, an intellectual in the Arab and Muslim slave trade community. He was a philosopher who helped justify the slavery that was going on. And then you fast forward to the 1700s, and Thomas Jefferson says practically the same thing. So anti-Blackness is the oldest form of human relations. You can think of it as an operating system, right? It's operating system 0. It's the first one that we have, and it's still running, right? For the majority of what remains in the memories of human history, okay? Now, this is tied to schooling because as Thiongo tells us, that although the colonization and enslavement of Africa was effected through conquering, sword and bullet, the night of the sword and bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the chalkboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom. So I know we've looked at education. I'll finish up here quickly. We've looked at education as a way of really trying to even the scales, right, of social inequity. But in truth, schooling was never intended, as it was related to compulsory efforts for Black people, it was never intended to promote Black wellness. It was always intended, actually, to undermine Black future and Black wellness. I say that it begins when African people, with all of their vast indigenous ideas, perspectives, cosmologies, were stuffed into dungeons, onto slave ships, experienced violence, those identities ripped from their literal flesh, transformed on plantations, where they were taught, seasoned really, to conform and to be obedient and to not run away, right? They built universities. The first universities and ongoing realities of our universities come from slave labor. And these people who had, again, vast cultural realities were forcibly transformed, forcibly made to speak English, right? Forcibly made to learn how to manage plantations, right? And if we see here on the left, what it takes, what kind of violence it takes to get to these people on the right, or more personally, what kind of violence it takes for me to say that my name is Dr. Kendrick Watson without missing a beat, right? What kind of violence had to happen throughout the line of my family in order for me to say that with no problem, right? And we're talking about wellness and health. So we think of schooling as seasoning because plantations were described as schools. And you look at the slave narratives of the life of Harriet Jacobs, she says that actually the lash and foul talk of her master and her sons were her teachers, right? Those were her first teachers. So schools are strange places, according to Hortense Spillers, because she says that they hire us, meaning Black people and critical allies or co-conspirators, we're their enemies. And we get these spaces to try to work against them. The original architects of Black education were intending to teach Black people the ideological outlook of the ruling order. They taught conformity, obedience, sobriety, piety, and the values of business or capitalism. They understood that when Black people became free after slavery, they probably had every psychological well-being and right to want to burn down everything around them. And so they used schools to manage that anger and to create people who would also help manage Black anger. So that's the history of schooling that we have to contend with as it's rooted within anti-Blackness. And I think I'll pass that on to Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Kendrick. Always thought-provoking, illuminating, insightful, poignant, hard and difficult to digest, but necessary. But we want to keep the conversation moving. So just so that folks who are out there know, we're going to have each of the panelists speak, and then we'll open up for question and answer, okay? So next I want to bring up Dr. Lamont Terry, someone else who I've been fortunate to work with at UCLA. Dr. Lamont Terry received his AB and MAT degrees, both in mathematics, from Occidental College, and holds a PhD in education from UCLA with an emphasis in urban schooling and mathematics education. He is currently the Associate Professor and Chair of Education at Occidental College, where he currently teaches undergrad classes on urban education, educational foundations, and critical race theory. A former middle school mathematics teacher and instructional coach, Dr. Terry also works with K-12 educators and higher education partners, developing culturally relevant approaches to learning in mathematics. In addition to his work in mathematics education, he helps K-12 teachers across content areas develop their social justice and anti-racist pedagogies, and to put those pedagogies into practice in school communities across the country. He, along with his wonder wife and partner, Diana, are raising 3 school-age sons, so he can relate and identify with this whole virtual schooling situation. Lamont, Devin Jamal, and Kareem Justice. Dr. Terry, the floor, or I should say the screen, is all yours.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Howard, and thank you, Dr. Watson, for setting us off today. So today, my talk, my piece is going to look at three issues. First, culture blindness, then the issue of cultural capital, building on what Dr. Watson has kind of shared with us in reference to the relationship between schools and anti-Blackness, and ultimately hoping to bring us to a point where we can think a little bit about cultural relevance. So even though our conversation today is on race and racial inequity in the time of COVID, I'm going to be a bit of a rebel and talk about culture, in particular culture blindness. And I think that this is really closely tied to this issue of color blindness. I think we all know well-meaning and good-natured folk who will say something like, well, I don't see race, I just see kids, right? And ultimately what they're trying to express is a disdain for racism. And part of the problem with that is we know that if we are unable to think through our relationships analytically along the lines of race, then ultimately we're going to be unable to deal with racism. And I think the same narrative can be provided with respect to culture, right? Culture blindness is this inability to see culture and to appreciate culture and to see how it's operating in our professional worlds. So let me talk a little bit about racialization. So we're, I think, well aware of the fact that we engage every day in this kind of racial calculus, right, which we call racialization. And what it is we, our brains hop to this, this calculus. I mean, for lack of a better term, not because I'm a math educator, but because I think that it's oftentimes abstract and obtuse and inaccessible to us, right? Why it is we do the things we do. But at any rate, we take otherwise distinct groups and we homogenize them through this racialization. And what ends up happening is we take this full geographic, linguistic, cultural diversity, and we pour it into one box, and we call them, in this case, Asian American. And that's problematic. I think we are well aware that we do that. It's helpful. It's a helpful handle. It's a shortcut. But ultimately, I think we lose quite a bit. We do it with Asian Americans. We do it with Latinx folks. And I think we also do it with Black folks, right? And I think in a lot of ways, I mean, really closely tied to Dr. Watson's notion of anti-Blackness that he's introducing to us here. I think we're less sensitive to how this happens with Black folk. It's difficult to look at a picture like this and to see the wealth of geographic diversity, linguistic diversity, ethnic heritage, right? That might exist in a group like this. For a lot of us, these are just Black people, right? And I think that is tied back to this notion of anti-Blackness. But what I want to say is that although these folks might be racialized as Black, they are nonetheless culturally diverse. And that's where this notion of culture blindness comes in. I mean, again, we do it knowing better, right? When we do studies of our populations, we talk about Black people in terms of being foreign-born or native-born. We recognize that Black people come from a variety of different experiences and have, again, different ethnic experiences, different cultural, linguistic experiences, but we racialize them all as Black, right? In fact, one of the things that I think is interesting is that in this year's census, Black folks who complete the census will be able to say for the first time where in fact they come from. So whether it's online or written, you can go in and you can identify as Black or African American, but then you can say, my heritage is from Ethiopia or from Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, right? You can go in and you can do that. And I think that's interesting. And it's going to lead to some really interesting outcomes in terms of what we know about the population of Black folks in terms of its diversity. But right off the bat, right, what I want to say is that one recommendation I would have for us as we think about what we need to be doing in our school communities is we need to stop conflating race and culture, right? It's a helpful shortcut for us, but ultimately it's harmful in terms of understanding who people are and what their experiences might be. Secondly, I think we need to work to develop authentic working understandings, so that is to say dynamic and growing understandings of the cultural diversity within and among those who might identify or be identified as Black. In order to do that, though, we need to understand something about culture. And so let me talk about this idea of social reproduction through this idea of cultural capital, right? So social reproduction theory says essentially that the dominant group in a society, in order to legitimize its rule, in order to normalize its rule, imposes its culture through pedagogic action. So this is exactly what Dr. Watson is talking about, right? And what this does is it facilitates the internalization of culture across a society. Folks like Bourdieu would say that cultural capital is this process of actually acquiring and internalizing and ultimately accepting that dominant culture and its values. So we're talking about things like how we possess the things that we wear on our body, the ways that we speak, what we know and what we consider as valuable. So morals, knowledge, all these things, right? These are things that are perpetuated and ultimately in schools reflect the dominant culture, right? So one of the things that we see, as Dr. Watson has said so well, is that schools then become a primary site for imposing cultural capital, right? So if you have a hard time seeing that, then let me give you an example. So this is data from an old study. California in around 2008 decided it wanted to pay attention to the achievement gap, the racial achievement gap. And it produced a number of really telling graphic organizers. And this is one, and I love showing this to folks because it really highlights what's going on in folks' minds. So this is academic data, right? It looks at API scores, Academic Performance Index, and it covers this data from grades 2 all the way to 11. And it covers it for it's disaggregated by racial ethnic subgroups. And what you see here is alphabetically racial ethnic subgroups listed, right? African-American on the left, American Indian, Asian and Filipino are disaggregated in terms of Asian America. Then you have Hispanic, Latino, Pacific Islander, right? Now, the interesting thing is if you look at this data, you see some of it is below, trending downwards, and some of it is trending upwards, right? And the interesting thing is if you look at, for 4 out of the 6 groups, if you look at their API scores, it has negative values. Well, we know that there are, if those of you are familiar, right, there's no negative API value. But in fact, what's being said here is there's a comparison being implied, right? That African American, American Indian, Hispanic Latino, Pacific Islander subgroups are in the red. They're negative in relation to the invisible group here, right? And if I were to show you where that data is, the data is here on the bottom, right, in this little chart. But graphically, visually, it's here. It's this baseline that I'm scrolling, that I'm putting my cursor across, right? That baseline is white, not of Hispanic origin. So when we talk about schools in the sort of the process of schooling, right, it is all geared towards the imposition of dominant culture, and whose experiences are normalized in this space is precisely white middle-class folks, right? And for that reason, right, you can have, in this particular example, you can have Asian and Filipino students outperforming white students, but yet still providing a baseline or a norm reference for what it means to do well in school. That's absurd, right? And it shows us the absurdity of white supremacy. So I think that when we take the issue of culture and we think about it, this is how we tend to talk about culture, right? This picture up on the top is sort of this is my hold hands and kumbaya, right? So our institutions present culture in this way. I think it stems from the dominant cultural group's view about culture, which is fundamentally Eurocentric. And the view is this, that any deviation from Eurocentric cultural norms is a deficit. It's a gap, it's a lack. And it's something that needs to be overcome, and schools are there to sort of help us do it. In fact, if you look below the picture, this is a screenshot from Google's homepage. Every now and again they have these images that are intended to inspire. And I was shocked last night as I was searching something to see that this young person, Sherin, who won this doodling contest, essentially reproduced this dominant view, right? Wonderful, artistic, beautiful illustration here. But I think it's ironic that it reflects this dominant view. So let me say a little bit more about this. The dominant group's view about culture, again, is a deficit. And if it's something to be overcome, how do we do that, right? So what we do in our schools, we acknowledge cultural difference. We teach our students how to appreciate it. And then ultimately, we want to welcome them in to participate in culture that is not their own, right? So acknowledge, appreciate, and participate. That's the standard way that we address cultural difference. And here's what I think that leads to. It leads to issues like this. I work at Occidental College. It's a private liberal arts college. And one of the things that happens is every year, we're not doing this now because we're not in person, but every year we have to send out a mass email to our student body to tell them when you get together and you celebrate Halloween this year, don't put on other people's culture, don't perform their culture. And inevitably, this is what we see. And I think we might be tempted to be embarrassed about this, right? We might be tempted to look at this and say, well, these are folks not in their best moments, right? These are, people, their alcohol is involved. They're not in their right minds. They're doing things that are aberrant. And what I would argue is that actually is not the case. What I think is happening is this is a product of how we see culture. It's a direct reflection of the dominant cultural group's view about cultural difference. What is that? Acknowledge cultural difference, appreciate the difference, and participate in it, right? And ultimately, the reason why we see Halloween costumes like this is because we've been telling students their whole lives that it's okay, it's permissible to transgress these boundaries. And I think that's a direct reflection of how we tend to think about culture. So I want to offer now a different definition of culture, perhaps a better definition of culture for your consideration. I'm going to play for you. Oh, I'm not going to play a clip for you because I forgot to change. I forgot to include the sound. I apologize. But this is a video clip of Dr. Barbara Sizemore. She was a Chicago educator, highly successful leader, and someone who dedicated her lives to speaking about the importance of Black culture. And her definition is slightly different than perhaps some of ours, right? So she would point to knowledge, ways of being, culture, customs, music, food, all of these things that are the material aspects of how we live in a society. But she, I think, emphasizes something different in her culture, and that is this, that people pick up culture in their, they accumulate and pick up and use culture in their own struggle for survival and autonomy, okay? And so she says, what happens is culture is a product of people's struggle for survival and autonomy. And one of the things that tends to happen there is that because the conditions in which we live as people change, our culture changes to respond to those changing conditions. So if we think that we can understand culture by opening up a book and reading about a group of people, and that book, as soon as that book gets dated, the conditions in which those people live have changed, and their culture is in the moment changing to respond to those changing conditions, right? And so herein lies the problem with our Heroes and Holidays approach to culture, right? We want to teach our kids to acknowledge difference, to appreciate it, and to participate in it. But the problem is you have people who are participating in a culture that's not their own, that is a direct reflection of a struggle that is not their own. And when we start to think about culture in those terms, we really quickly begin to see how problematic our approach to culture is. So, a third recommendation I would have for folks as they think about this is to recognize that culture is not static. It's not in stasis. It's not monolithic. It doesn't stand still. It changes. And if culture changes, culture is unlikely to be well understood outside of folks' current struggle for survival and autonomy. So that is to say, if you want to understand people's culture, you need to understand the conditions in which they live. You need to understand the structures and the policies that shape their life and how they are responding to those challenges. Therein is culture. Fourthly, we need to locate, right? I'm speaking to myself as well here. We need to locate our learning within schools and communities in order to develop a sense of culture and a professional philosophy that responds to people's culture as it is, not as it's depicted in dusty textbooks, okay? So when I think about culturally relevant pedagogy, I think specifically about the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings. She wrote this book in 2000. I think the second edition came out in 2005, called The Dream Keepers. Many of you are familiar with it, of course. She looked at highly successful teachers of African American Black youth. And it was through this observation of effective teachers that she began to develop this sense of culturally relevant pedagogy. Now, I think she's in the process of retiring. If she has one foot out, as far as I understand. She's kind of passed the torch on to some of her students who have produced this book on the right, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. And if you like, culturally sustaining pedagogies is culturally relevant pedagogy 2.0. And I would argue that the difference between these two is really, it really hinges on this idea that culture is not static, right? That what's happening in schools should be designed to sustain people's cultural selves, right? As it changes, as it responds to the conditions in which they live. So I want to end by talking to you quickly about her three pillars, which I think are enduring and meaningful to us as educators and to you in your professional work. The first pillar of culturally relevant pedagogy is having high expectations for academic success. So culturally relevant professionals work, their professional work is designed at helping students to be successful in all the institutional ways. So we talked about Bourdieu and that cultural capital, right? So culturally relevant pedagogues would say, look, we understand what's happening in schools. We understand that there's sites of oppression and reproduction. And we want people, well, at the end of the day, even revolutionaries got to eat, right? So there's got to be something, there got to be a way in which we can help to preserve and create opportunity for people to participate in the economy, right? And so you want students to get good grades. You want them to have math literacy, science literacy, being able to write well. So all these sort of traditional metrics that we would use to pinpoint academic success, these are the things that culturally relevant pedagogues care about. But moreover, they care, their concern is much broader than those standard metrics. They care about leadership. They care about personality development. They care about the social and cultural networks and the clubs, right? The thriving of life of Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? So it's all these sort of metrics of leadership and success, right? And this is what CRP cares about. The second pillar is about cultural competence. Now, this is the one that I think is most challenging for many folks. Gloria Ladson Billings actually says that she feels like professionals need to be at least bicultural. So we talk about bilingual, having your home language, your native language, and then having proficiency in a second language, right? And so she talks about cultural competence in that same way. She says that that students need to come through schools with their cultural selves intact. So culturally relevant pedagogy aims at providing experiences where students don't have to leave their cultural selves at the door, that in fact, when they come into these classrooms and into these school communities, they see their cultures represented. They see their struggle represented in school, in class, in relationship with school officials. But it's not just students that need to be culturally competent. She says teachers and professionals need to be culturally competent in at least two ways. First, their own, right? We need to understand ourselves. You know, for example, white folks can't say, what is white culture? It is just the culture of domination, right? So that doesn't get it. But you have to understand yourself, and you have to be fluent in at least one other cultural competency, right? And this is this idea of really caring about students. And if we take Barbara Sizemore's definition to task, right, in order to learn about culture, we have to move outside of books, and we have to look at what's happening in people's communities, in school and outside of school. And thirdly, and finally, the third pillar is that of critical consciousness. So Dr. Ladson Billings says that what we should be doing with our curriculum and with our instruction is we should be working to help students see the possibility for transforming the world that they live in. When they see injustices, they should be able to know that their math, science, their writing skills, their critical thinking, that all these skills that they learn in school can be aimed at and deployed in service of transforming the things that they care about, transforming and changing the injustices, right? So we teach towards critical consciousness. We teach so that people can understand the world they live in, to understand how their world is being shaped by structures and policies, et cetera. And ultimately they see a possibility and potential to change through what they learn in school. So it's with these three pillars, I think, that we can begin to address our cultural blindness. Number one, to understand that we are cultural blind, that often we don't pay attention to culture. Number two, that there is an operant culture in our professional spheres, not just on the school sites, but even in our offices, right? These offices are defined by dominant culture, and that's something that we acknowledge, and it's part of reproduction of the dominant group's position in society. And then thirdly, we can begin to think about the possibility for cultural relevance to address our goals and making sure that students, as well as teachers, administrators, and our professional colleagues are well in these respects. I'll end there.
Wow. That's all I can say. Wow. I think that was excellent, Dr. Terry, and a beautiful, beautiful building on Dr. Watson's points around anti-Blackness. And we know that one of the ways that anti-Blackness is manifested in schools is in the cultural appropriation, cultural misalignment, cultural misunderstanding that happens between teachers and students. And I think what you just provided was an important and really tangible set of ways in which this misunderstanding of culture oftentimes works to the disadvantage of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, students of color in particular, and ways in which we all need to be mindful, reflective, thoughtful about how we can sort of move away from these static notions of culture, the essentializing of our students, and really this digs into sort of the ways in which we form this relational understanding with our students and recognizing and understanding that not all Black, brown folks, Indigenous folks are the same. The variation that exists within groups is important. And that takes time, and that takes trust, and that takes building, and that takes learning. And this is the heavy, hard work that is so critical for the work that the educators are all required to do in this moment. So I want to say thank you for that important presentation. I want to tell folks, I see some of the important questions that are coming through in the chat. Keep them coming. We're going to make sure we get to as many as we can after our final panelists, because I think that our panelists have given us a lot of food for thought, and we want to make sure we have time for them to respond to them. So I want to next move on to our next panelist, Dr. Jolan Smith. Jolan Smith is an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Advanced Studies in Education and Counseling at California State University, Long Beach. In the College of Education, Dr. Smith teaches courses in assessment and evaluation of students with disabilities and positive classroom supports and collaborative methods for inclusive settings within the education specialist credentialing program. She also serves as a faculty mentor to elementary, secondary, and special education credential students in the Mary Jane Patterson Teachers for Urban Schooling Scholarship Initiative at the College of Education. What this initiative does is aims to support a pipeline of culturally responsive teachers to serve communities and students who have historically been marginalized. A former special education teacher of students with moderate to severe disabilities in Title I schools and alternative settings, Dr. Smith's research focuses on collaboration to serve juvenile justice-involved youth with disabilities, community-partnered autism, disparity research, and Black family caregiver engagement and special education. Dr. Smith, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. And thank you, Dr. Watson and Dr. Terry. You guys gave us lots to think about. And I just want to make sure, can everybody see me? Oh, there we go. Okay, everybody there? I'm there, okay. Wanted to make sure that, thank you so much, Dr. Howard, Dr. Watson, Dr. Terry. Lots of food for thought, and I will definitely be connecting and back to a lot of what you all talked about earlier. As Dr. Howard said, it's important that we identify who are we talking about, right? Concha started when she mentioned the communities that are disproportionately impacted, right, through COVID. And so these are just some graphs that from LA Unified that tells a little bit about what happened in the spring, right, when we were responding to COVID, and just looks at student engagement, right, from March 16th to May 22nd. And as you can see here, I like to show these graphs because it's just a visual, right? So we can see that engagement was really low. And this is for secondary students, middle school and high school students. It was very low, particularly for our Black and brown communities, our Black and Hispanic communities. And at the highest peak down here, we only had about 67% of Black families and 67% of Black and Hispanic families in middle school participating and engaging at all. This is really troubling, right? When we think about this was the response in the springtime and who's being left behind, right? Who's being disproportionately impacted. In addition to race and ethnicity, right, we also need to look at those other special populations. As Dr. Howard said, I focus on students with disabilities. And so among students with disabilities, we had very, very low engagement and very low participation, right, through the period that was studied. As same with our English language learners, our families with low income, and then also our homeless and our foster care youth, right? So looking at this, obviously this was the data from the spring. There was lots that happened over the summertime, but these early data let us know that we need to do more, particularly for specific populations. It's not enough to just think about the larger school system, but we need to give special attention and focus to certain communities and groups, right? And looking at that, we want to think about how are we engaging our families, right? If we think about engaging our families, we definitely need to think about how are we seeking parent and caregiver input. Oftentimes, we're not asking the right people. We're not inviting the right people to the table to have a say-so in what we're doing in the systems that we're developing, right? So we need to identify stakeholders, parents and caregivers, family members who represent the communities that are disproportionately impacted. We need parents and caregivers of students with disabilities. We need English language learners, and we need to learn about their particular trials and challenges and successes as well, right? That's what Dr. Terry was talking about, the culture, right? And culture is what you deploy when you struggle for survival and autonomy, right? So we need to learn from these different communities so that we can know how are they activating their networks, right? What are they doing to go around these systems or to learn about and help their students, help their children, right? Our foster youth, they had some of the lowest participation and engagement from the spring. So we absolutely need to think about how are we supporting our foster and homeless youth, right? Or youth who are experiencing homelessness. We need to make sure that they are connected to services. And again, our low-income families, our families who are having some economic challenges, right? It's important to not only think about the challenges that they're experiencing, but to identify their successes. Every single family has some success, but the dominant culture just might not be defining it as success. But every single family, every single individual has some type of success that you can grow on. It's important to identify what the family's goals are, especially in this COVID time. Unfortunately, you have there are a lot of school officials who are automatically thinking that our communities are falling behind, right? And that they're not learning. And there's just a drastic loss. That might be true, but I can guarantee that they're also learning. So as stakeholders, we need to identify what is it that our families and our students are bringing to the table. What are they teaching at home? How are they teaching it, right? Is it important? Is independence the important goal for the family, for the student independence? Or is it codependence because the family wants the student to realize their place within the larger family structure, right? When we operate under the dominant culture, we're assuming that independence is the goal. But we need to check in with our families and find out what goals they have for their students and what are some of the successes that they have already achieved so that we can continue to grow on that. We need to ask, what's the family schedule? Particularly for our low-income families, right? Or any family for that matter. You have a lot of adults who work night shift or maybe are laid off right now or whatever it might be. Maybe the family support and the adult support for a student is not available during the daytime. And maybe the support is available in the evening time, or maybe it's available on the weekend. It's very important that teachers, school officials, we ask about that. We ask the family, is there adult support for the child during the day? It's important to know that, right? Because then we know whether or not there's an adult in the house to help with the technological glitches and problems that we're having. And that could be one of the potential reasons why, in particular, our middle school students in the graph above that I showed before, those middle school students were really suffering, more so than our high school students. And for me, I think that's probably because our high school students have a little bit more know-how, and they've learned how to navigate these systems a little bit better than our middle school students. So we really need to look at those data and to see where we need to provide the support, right? Again, we need to normalize family differences, right? As Dr. Terry said, culture is dynamic. It's not, there's not one Black culture, right? Culture is different from different groups. So we need to normalize difference, right? Everybody is different. Even within one particular group, there are lots and lots of differences. I don't know, I'm hoping that everyone is aware of what's happening in the world and current news, but there was a teacher in Florida, I'll just call her teacher, Miss Edith. Miss Edith basically went viral when she addressed the school board saying what parents are doing in these Zoom videos, and how parents are drinking before noon and they're smoking in the house and they're doing all of this other stuff. I read another article from San Antonio where a teacher gave an anonymous quote to the newspaper saying that one of the parents appeared in the video wearing an ankle monitor. None of that matters, because the key ideal there is that the child was present in Zoom and in class, right? So as school officials, as educators, we need to normalize family difference. Not every family operates the same way. Families do everybody operates differently based on their composition, what's available, and everything. So we need to teach that. As educators, we need to teach students to acknowledge difference and respect difference. I love when Kanchi said that at the beginning, and she said, respect each other, right? And educate each other too on these differences, right? Listen to and explain other perspectives and other ways of being. This is the time now where we need to teach empathy. And it starts with us as the adults, right? Because if we normalize things, then our students will tend to normalize things. We also need to concentrate on communicating often and regularly with our families, right? And this communication is not one way. It's not us sending messages about what we expect, but it's learning from our families as well. Again, like I said, ask about the family goals. So what are the learning goals for your child this year? It was, I'm so interested because last year, I'm raising a 4th grader this year. And last year, the school is great. They always send them a parent survey asking these types of questions. What are the goals do you have? What academic goals do you have for your child this year? Any behavioral goals? But one thing that I noticed is that survey has not come out this year. And it's almost as if everybody is just responding in crisis mode and not using what we know works in teacher practice and what we know works in good family school partnerships and relationships. We need to communicate positive messages, right? I'm seeing a lot in the news right now about school districts and the punitive measures that are being used with families. And while some families with money and affluence, they're forming their learning pods, other families and low-income communities are being sent notices of being truant and various different punitive consequences instead of saying positive messages and encouraging messages. So I always think we need to adopt this coach mentality of you can do it. Yes, we're in this together. I know it's hard right now, but I'm here to help you and work with you. I think that's that trauma-informed care and that the empathy that we're looking for when we're engaging with our families. When we engage with our students, it's really important right now to realize that they have been, for the most part, isolated and disconnected from their peers and their opportunities to socialize and engaging with the school community, right? So I've been happy with reports that I've been receiving and hearing about some teachers in some schools who are actually allowing students to eat together on Zoom. allowing students to come together and talk informally, and not have everything be structured, because it's that connection that will bring students back to the school community and to the school setting, right? But when you're only having students engaging with the instructor and then the instructor engaging with the students, and it's only in that direction but not together, not peer-to-peer, not engaging and utilizing the breakout rooms, you will have students who will feel disconnected, and they will feel pushed out and just not wanting to engage if they're only able to speak directly to the teacher, right? So think about bringing the fun back into school again. Dr. Sherin mentioned earlier when we first started off, he said that the music reminded him of his 7th grade talent show. We need to bring those fun elements of education back into school if we want our students to come and be involved, right? We have thrown out positive behavior supports. Dr. Howard in my intro mentioned how I teach positive behavior supports and classroom management supports in the credential program. We need to bring back the positive behavior supports. Let's encourage our students to turn in their work on time. Let's encourage them to turn on their Zoom cameras, right? Instead of threatening them and yelling and being punitive and saying, if you don't turn on your camera, I'm going to contact your parent, right? That's going to push a student away, particularly a secondary student in the middle school or the high school, right? But instead, you can use Class Dojo, right? And award the points right there for all the students who have turned their assignment in on time. And then maybe at the end of the week or whatever, have a raffle drawing for the students to really encourage them, right? We can do the talent show on a Friday, right? And have students be excited and working towards the opportunity to be in the Friday talent show, or to engage in the Friday lunch session on Zoom, where the teacher turns off his or her video and the students just get to talk to each other, right? They know that the teacher is still listening, but you are creating this opportunity for socialization, right? It's really important that we establish communal norms, right? One of the things in my class, I teach about the function of class meetings and to build the opportunity to talk and relate and have students share their emotions and what they think are important rules to have together in order to be able to learn as a community. Those things need to be done in our Title I schools and our low-income schools. And unfortunately, I do not see them happening there. I see them happening in the more affluent schools. I see them happening in higher SES communities and those types of schools. But for some reason, when it comes to our Black and Brown students, we tell them what the rules are. We tell them what the dominant culture expects of them, right? And we tell them that you need to match this behavior norm, right? We need to use those same strategies of coming together as a community and establishing what we all believe should be the communal norms, right? Let's go back to class duties, because when we establish communal norms, then we have people who are willing to step up to the plate and say, hey, I'd like to be the recorder for this group, or, teacher, if you don't mind, I can help you with this, or we can monitor this. And you're really in building that sense of community and responsibility for students, right? Because if students know that they have a responsibility and a duty, then they will show up. They will feel encouraged. They will feel part of the community and more likely to participate. We need to use multiple formats and multiple ways of reaching our students, right? I think about our students with disabilities who are included in general education classrooms right now, and they're struggling. They are struggling because our teachers are struggling, and we get that, right? So teachers, it's a lot on you right now. Yes, we need multiple formats of instructions, right? I've been watching lots of videos and watching teachers, and there's lots of oral instruction when you have the group together, right? But we also know that our students are being supported by adults in the homes, so we also need to provide written instructions and written details, right? Create a video and show people through video, right? So we need to think about the multiple different ways that we can present information, the multiple different ways that we can have students engage and show what they're learning, right? That's universal design for learning. I'm talking to a room full of educators, so I know you know this, but we need to really think and provide the space to build all of those different formats, right? So we need to use our aides. We need to use parents who can support us, and all the different, it's all hands on deck in order to provide all the different multiple formats that our students and our families will need. We need to make sure that our students and families who are immigrants or English language learners, that they're able to support their students as well, right? So again, we're thinking about engaging our parent PTAs and our parent organizations so that we can provide the support to other parents who maybe don't have the language or maybe feel uncomfortable interacting with school officials, right? And there's lots of research that shows that various communities do not feel as comfortable interacting with school providers. So we absolutely need to engage our families and use them and make sure that they're working with us to reach all of our families and all of our students, right? And then lastly, we just need to give each other grace and be patient with each other, be empathetic and slow down. I just feel, especially now in this fall, I feel we've been in such a rush to make sure that we get the learning going. We have to make sure that we catch up and get the students up, and everybody is just stressed out. But in good teacher prep, we know that the first month of school, you're getting to know your students. You're getting to know your families, right? And in this new format, that connection is going to feel a little foreign. And everybody's going to approach it differently in terms of their comfort level using technology to connect. I had office hours last night with a student, and we talked for 40 minutes, and it had nothing to do with the course content. It was all about how the student is just managing life right now and the 5 classes. So as our K-12 teachers and school people, we need to think about that. We need to think about, where do we go with our MTSS systems? Where are our multiple tiers? Where is our support that we can bring into the virtual classroom and the Zoom room so that we can make sure that students are feeling connected, that we have the adult manpower to break out into smaller discussion groups and connect and talk about our emotions, right? And use our restorative justice talking circles to really connect and talk about how we're impacted by the death of Chadwick Boseman or the death of RBG, right? We need to allow that space and create that space for not just ourselves as adults, but also our students. We are at square one right now, especially with this virtual learning. We are kind of building over again. And it's just really important that we take the time to slow down, be patient with each other, and realize that we will all make mistakes, and we will all learn from the mistakes and get better. And we should not hold our students to standards that we don't even adhere to ourselves, right? We're expecting our students to be present 100% of the time and engaged 100% of the time. But how many of us are right now multitasking or doing different things right now? So these are the things I think about as we move forward, and the things that I think that as practitioners, we need to ensure that we're allowing the space and giving each other the grace and being patient with ourselves, our students, parents, and our administrators. And with that, I'm gonna join back in. Oops.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Again, powerful, relevant, meaningful, doable strategies. Can't say thank you enough. I'm so appreciative of the manner in which your work always is mindful and sensitive to the unique challenges of our students with disabilities. I think oftentimes we overlook our student with disabilities population. And that's so vital in this work, because when we talk about intersections of anti-Blackness, anti-racism, oftentimes there's a void there. And so I think your work speaks to that in some powerful ways. And so I just want to thank Dr. Smith. I want to thank Dr. Terry. I want to thank Dr. Watson for just dropping some serious jewels and some powerful points of information. So I want to move to a bunch of questions we have, and we're going to try to get through as many as we can. Folks continue to send them through the chat, send them through the Q&A. So I'm just going to go through some of the ones that I have, and I'll kind of make sure I point my question to who I think it's directed to, and then you all can chime in as you see fit. Let me start off with Dr. Terry. One of the questions that came up was, How can you sort of make the distinction, or what is the distinction in your sort of, conceptualization between cultural participation versus cultural appropriation?
Well, yeah, that's. I think there's a thin line there between appropriating another person's culture and participating. I think we certainly, I think we certainly set up the possibility for participation to grow into appropriation, and that was the point of my comments in the presentation. But what distinguishes potentially one from the other is not that we don't want to share. I think about Black folks. We want to share our experiences. We want to share ourselves, and we are some of the most welcoming people on the planet, as I know. But the thing is that as we talk about moving within and among other people, I think the really operant point is understanding that this stuff comes from people's struggles, and that it requires a certain amount of respect of struggle, of people's resilience and work to survive despite what's happening in the society. And I think if we can teach our students that at a young age, then we are, by the way, which happens to be consistent with the third pillar of CRP, right? This idea that we should be using school experience to help develop critical consciousness within our students. But if we can do that, right, if we're not just all heroes and holidays and happy, if we can begin to engage our young ones in discussions about what's wrong about the world and not be afraid that we're going to send their worlds crashing down, they can handle it. But if we start to have those kinds of conversations, then they can participate with people who are different than them culturally in a way that's respectful of the fact that they have a different experience, right? And that some students may have a harder time than I have, right? And they begin to start to think about relative privileges and different ways that we're positioned in society. So that's my sense. I think that's the crux there, is understanding that culture comes from struggle, and it's not just out there, objective on the calendar.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dr. Terry. One of the things I oftentimes hear teachers say to me is that, well, I'm a white person, I've got a child of color, racially, we're just so different, I don't know that I could ever connect with them. And I always think that if there's an authentic and real sort of robust understanding of culture, that bridge can be built. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that's some of that interaction between race and culture that I was trying to get at the opening of our conversation.
Absolutely. Let me direct my next question to Dr. Watson, because several sort of iterations of this came up. So what are some ways, Dr. Watson, that we can promote wellness and how can we promote the eradication of anti-Blackness in schools and in classrooms?
Yeah, I have some slides. I'm just going to talk, and if folks need visuals, let me know. But anti-Blackness is the sediment of our world. It was transferred through the roots of colonization globally, and the frameworks of school really, those are a part of the structure, the social structure that was built to legitimize the violence that has animated our land. One way that we typically start meetings like this is to talk about land acknowledgments and folks who have been stewards of this land. And just in the way that colonization has never ended, that's why we would say that we're in Los Angeles or California as opposed to Tonga Nation or Turtle Island. Anti-Blackness as a practice of schooling has also really never ended. It's transformed. People have fought against it. And I think that Dr. Smith and Dr. Terry have offered some really powerful interventions that I would offer. What I would say is people have been trying to enliven from the moment that we were put onto those ships. That's what we've been doing. And so you're talking now to folks hundreds of years into this process who are still attempting to provide a way of just living and being. So I study the impact of this on our cells, and what we find is that Black students who are, as Dr. Terry just mentioned, attuned to the world around them, that are understanding and have been given some support in understanding the true nature of the system that we're in. Their cells are healthier. They're not dying as quickly as Black students who are essentially being gaslit by their education and gaslit by their experiences. So we experience violence, and I think Uplift, something David Stovall often talks about, people who experience violence are true authorities on what that kind of violence does to them and how it looks, right? And the only reason that we undermine that authority is if we try to avoid having the conversations that affirm their knowings. So when Black students understand the violence, or Latinx students understand the violence that happens to them, they tend to be healthier. A bit further into schooling, telomeres, which is what protective caps at ends of our chromosomes that really mark our biological as opposed to our chronological age, they shorten rapidly in Black youth. Okay, so Black folks have a lower life expectancy than other folks, and we can trace that with telomeres, and we find that young Black people, their cells are actually eradicating at a faster rate than other students. And one of the ways that a colleague of mine has been able to sort of stall that eradication and also reverse it, meaning build life and health back into her young students, is by simply letting go of all of these normative violent practices of schooling that Dr. Smith was saying we tend to sort of rely on and we should be releasing. When my colleague's name is Tiffany Marie, she teaches up in the Bay Area, when she let go of certain practices like de-emphasize grading and standards, which I know is an ongoing fight that we have, de-emphasize the necessity to even think through discipline or even some of the systems of transformative justice that have been put into our spaces. When she de-emphasized those realities, she de-emphasized being inside and got outside, got into nature. And when she, to borrow something Dr. Terry's talking about, helped the young students remember some of their indigenous language. So taught the Ne to some of the Latinx and indigenous students there, taught Yoruba to some of the Black students, and all of the students learned how to speak with djembe, which is a West African drum. When they learned that language and infused culturally relevant and historically grounded practices that we all had on board prior to colonization and slavery, these kids' cells, some of whom were shorter, their telomeres were shorter than women who were 3 times their age and had survived breast cancer, these 14-year-old babies, right? Within 1 year, she had stalled that aging process and reversed it. Okay, which if you're up on the biology around telomeres, people are not, that is a surprising thing, right? We don't think that should happen. And so for me, that just tells me that one of the ways to promote wellness is to actually release the violences of schooling and promote and uplift the life-giving reality of education, something that people have always had. And that's a contradiction in our society because we need people to be able to go through school, we say, to get access into the economy in order to feed themselves and shelter themselves, which everyone on this call knows that's not a guarantee even if you do it. Plus you get debt, plus you get microaggressions, plus you get all this other stuff. So it's strange to me that COLLEGE, matriculation, is how we spell FOOD. That's a strange way to spell it, folks. And so I think if we're gonna be anti-racist, we gotta be anti-capitalist. There is no way to do both. And there's some really powerful models. I've seen a brother, I think he's in New Jersey, who his main school site, he's a principal, his main school site is, they open up the space. This is a lot of things that Dr. Smith talking about. They open up the space from 6 to 11 p.m. every day. The youth who are there are able to wash their clothes. They feed them 3 meals a day, right? These school sites become places that infuse what everyone should deserve, regardless of how well they do on any test, how well their reading comprehension is. That's food, shelter, and clothing. We should not tie that to achievement. That needs to be de-emphasized and actually abolished. That would be my suggestion. And to the point of the cellular growth, we had a young person in our study who we thought had colon cancer. He was 22 years old at UCLA. They found polyps all in his colon. He had really short telomeres. And we started offering him these practices, these wellness practices that are rooted in ancestral knowledge and knowing, being in nature, re-engaging language, right? Practicing mindfulness. And he graduated from UCLA and was unhoused, lost people in his life, all these really adverse experiences that we know should harm your health. And his telomeres grew, right? They stopped deteriorating and grew. He's now cancer-free. We did his polyps are gone. We did a documentary about him. And on the day that we finished wrapping up his story, his name is Philmon, I get in my car, and that's when I find out that Chadwick Boseman has died from colon cancer on the day. And so I think that it's so necessary to be thinking about this in an urgent way and to detangle schooling from our education and detangle wellness and the right to life from performance. That would be my suggestion.
Man, thank you for that, Dr. Watson. I think your words about sort of the deterioration of telomeres helps to further illustrate the fact that racism is not only causing high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety, it is leading to shorter lives, and it's happening to our children at younger ages. And so if this doesn't sort of serve as our wake up call to action, I'm not sure what else will, given the fact that there is biological and physiological data and evidence now that tells us when our young people are in these spaces, the outcomes are fatal in some ways. And that is alarming. That should be our collective call to action. I don't know what more we need to see and hear other than we hear those kinds of devastating data. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Smith, you mentioned something I think is so important that I think we don't do enough of, is engaging our caregivers, talking to them, listening to them, hearing what their concerns are. But one of the things that frustrates me is I hear from lots of educators who say, well, I want to talk to the caregivers, but they're just not showing up. They're not visible. They're not present. What would you say to those folks when they respond to the fact that there are families and caregivers and parents who are just not accessible? What suggestions or strategies would you recommend?
Well, I would say definitely you have to go outside of your comfort zone to reach people who don't want to be reached, right? So a lot of times we operate only as educators and practitioners, we want to operate within certain given hours, right? But we need to realize that parents might need to call them on a Saturday morning or on a Saturday evening or in the evening time on a weekend or on weeknight. And you might need to go and do a home visit. We forget these things, right? We teach in teacher education that you need to do a neighborhood walk, right? Learn the communities from which your students are coming from, right? No parent is going to run from the educator who shows up, right? And outside. You might not get let in, but after time and time, you keep showing that effort, they will eventually say, this educator is pretty serious. This person obviously wants to say something to us or wants to build a connection, right? I think that the challenge is that we always expect parents to come to us. We expect the caregivers to come to us or come to the school setting in some type of way. But we have to be willing to go outside of our comfort zone and to go reach parents and caregivers exactly where they are.
Let me go a little bit further, and I'm curious what you say about this. Is part of the challenge in that approach the mental models that many educators have? If the mental models see families and see caregivers through a deficit lens or don't seem to understand or recognize all the sort of resilience and amazing amounts of sort of compassion and care that these caregivers show every single day, if the mental models are not appropriate, is that part and parcel of the problem?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You have a lot of educators right now and practitioners who just really don't know the communities that they're teaching in, right? They don't live in the community. They don't know the students. They don't know the families. And so when you don't know and you don't have firsthand knowledge based on personal experience, I talk about this all the time when we talk about perceptions of disability, right? When you don't have that firsthand experience, you rely on images from the media and you rely on messages that are passed to you through family, right? And so it's the same thing when it comes to understanding groups that are not yours, right? So if you don't have a personal relationship with Black families and Black communities in special education, you are going to rely on what you see in the media about them. You're going to rely on what you've been told over and over again. And until you have that engaging interaction, those interactions that are authentic and filled with respect and learning and educating each other, right? I think that's another thing too. As practitioners, we have gone through the college, right? We've gone through our programs and we think we know everything. And so I am imparting my knowledge on you. I'm the educator, so I will tell you how best your child learns, right? But the first teachers that we have are our parents. Our parents and our caregivers know us the most, right? So it's the caregivers who need to teach the educators, right, about how best my child learns, how to reach my child when they tend to shut down on you, right? But you have so many educators who think, I was talking about this the other day in a dialogue the other day where educators didn't want to call the student's parent because the educator wanted to maintain the power, right? The educator wanted to be the person responsible for getting that student to acquiesce. And although the entire school team knew that it was the parent that could reach that student, right? So we get into these conflicts and these power dynamics, and it makes me think about what Dr. Watson was saying, right? You have the juxtaposition of Blackness and whiteness, right? And so Blackness is being bad, right? And so if we feel that we know everything and we're coming to impart the knowledge, it's because we do see you as being deficient in some way, right? And so, yes, absolutely. We need to definitely balance that and realize that as educators, I say this all the time in my teacher ed programs, there's a reason why we need to be lifelong learners. And I love the content, the comment, Dr. Terry, culture is dynamic. It's not static. You will never all of a sudden be able to check and say, yes, I know Black culture now, right? Because it is forever changing. It's forever dynamic, and it's different depending on the different families and individuals and what they've experienced.
That's an excellent point. And I always raise this issue around culture when I have folks think about just the variation that exists within our own families. These are folks we share some of the same DNA with, same chromosomal makeup, right? And if you think about the fact that for those of you who have siblings, right, you can think about how different you may be from the very folks who were raised with you for many years. And so if that kind of variation exists within your own sort of household, or for those of you who have children, sometimes you look at your own children. I got 4, all very different in so many ways. And so you see the sort of the dynamicism, if you will, of how culture plays out even within households. So if it happens within households, you can only imagine how it plays out across groups as well. So I so appreciate you mentioning that point, Dr. Smith, and building up Dr. Terry. Let me come to Dr. Terry. Is culture responsive pedagogy an antidote to anti-Blackness?
So I think if we take Dr. Watson's lead here, then I think what we understand is that anti-Blackness would suggest to us that society is really robust as it pertains to our quick fixes or, policy reforms. As I understand anti-Blackness, and I'm a student of it, I'm a relatively new student of it, but that's the scholarly take, right? The scholarly articulations of anti-Blackness. Of course, I've experienced it throughout my life, but my understanding is that what folks who are articulating this are suggesting is that it helps us to understand more deeply sort of the ontology of what it means to be Black, right? So that there is this natural limit between Black bodies and humanity. And so I think when people talk about anti-Blackness, when folks like Dr. Watson come and share their expertise, it helps us to see that the very first move is one of deep reflection and learning, not how can I fix this, right? And so I think about our institution. So Dr. Watson is a colleague of mine at Occidental College. This summer, in response to George Floyd's murder, my own institution, my faculty colleagues got together and within their department structures and began to type out these proclamations and manifestos about how they were going to challenge anti-Blackness in their department. And, I think in part because of what I've learned from Dr. Watson and others, right, that the understanding of anti-Blackness is a call to understand the deeper antagonism, and it really frustrates this idea that I can just hire more Black teachers or offer another class in Black studies, and that will fix the problem and all of this other stuff that's happening in society, this unrest. And so when I think about culturally relevant pedagogy, and I'm thinking deeply about this, I'm deeply committed to the idea that teachers need to understand themselves culturally and their students culturally as well. But I think that we still have a lot more learning to do. I do think that if we talk about pedagogy as an individual philosophy that can be meaningful in classrooms and in schools, that there is some sense in which pedagogy can have a structural impact. But I wouldn't go so as far as to say that if everyone, all 428 of us here, commit to CRP, that we're going to undo anti-Blackness. I think that's a misread of what's going on with anti-Blackness, and I think we all have a lot more learning to do in that way.
Thank you for that. Let me give a quick second to see if anybody wants to chime in with the question verbally. I know we've got some comments that have come in the chat, questions that have come in the chat. Our time is getting short, and I want to give each of the panelists about 60 seconds to close out before we conclude this powerful panel. Does anyone want to chime in with the question? Any of the participants? Going once, going twice. Okay. Let me do this. I know one of the questions that has come up, and I'll let each of you respond to it because I know this is always a bit of a tricky issue. There have been requests for your PowerPoint presentations. I don't know your standing policies on that. If you're completely not comfortable with it, I understand it. I get that. But if you, and I've also asked folks have asked if they can have your contact information, email address that you might be willing to share if you don't mind. Can you put that in the chat? Let me go around to each of you one final time. And again, I want to just preface by saying thank you, thank you, thank you. All three of you have been illuminating. You have not pulled any stops. You have been poignant. You've been evidence-based. You've been strategy-centered. You've really offered me, and I'm hopeful of all the other participants here, significant, I do mean significant food for thought about how we move to action and things that we can do to begin to uproot some of the systemic approaches to anti-Black racism that are unfortunately a part of our landscape. So I want to go to each of our panelists to see if you have some final closing words, suggestions. I want to give you about 60 seconds each, and then I'll close this out and pass it back on to Conchi. So I'll start with Dr. Smith.
So much to cover. I guess 60 seconds. Be radical. Be radical. And one of the things, what I mean by that is put those who have the most need first, right? So when I was in the classroom, I would always prioritize the student who needed the most. And at this day and time, our Black students need a lot, right? Because of anti-Blackness. It's rooted in our system, right? I think about this all the time when I'm trying to create my PowerPoints. I'm very intentional about finding positive images of dark-skinned people, because society will have you believe that our prisons, that's where they go. Our dark-skinned people will go in prisons and in these negative outcomes. I was reading one of the comments in the chat where it says, well, how can we turn this around and be more positive? We need to be radical and find those images, create those images, right? Partner with collaborators who can create those images, because they're not out there. Whenever I try to find stuff about discipline, I only see Black students, right? And so you have to turn these things on their head. And that's what I mean by be radical.
I love that notion of be radical, Dr. Smith. I also love the idea of the ways in which we need to have a longer conversation about colorism, in the ways in which anti-Blackness plays out within groups, and even within other non-Black groups, that the degrees to which anti-Blackness plays out around colorism. So I know some of my Latinx, some of my Native Indigenous folks, and some of my Asian American folks can attest to that, because we see it and we hear it play out all too often. So I appreciate your notion about be radical, be radical, be radical. Dr. Terry, closing thoughts.
Well, I appreciate my colleagues on the panel, Dr. Howard, your leadership, and the opportunity to just come and share with folks today. In closing, I guess I would remind us of the prescient words of one of our own prophets, James Baldwin. James Baldwin, in an interview near the end of his life, he said this, and I quote, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time and in one's work. And part of the rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all of the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference. Most of the times when I hear that quote, it stops at rage. And I'm thinking about one of the chats, one of the Q&As that we didn't get to, but this idea of how do we, is it possible to teach Black culture in a way that isn't characterized as by systemic poverty and the pathologizing of Black folk and the criminalization therein. And I think that's a complicated question. I would be weary of trying to teach culture apart from the material circumstances in which people live. And that is not to say that we should pathologize Black being, Black bodies, Black culture, but I think it's instructive to understand the conditions that we live in, and I think that is going to produce rage. It should produce rage in us, and that's okay. And I think there are productive responses to that rage that we can engage in. So appreciate everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terry. Always informed, motivated, inspired by the words of James Baldwin. So thank you for dropping that jewel on us. Dr. Watson, final words as we prepare to close out.
Yeah, honored to be on here with the panel with Dr. Smith and Dr. Terry, and learned so much. Actually sitting here, took notes and screenshots. Thank you for your knowledge, and thank you, Dr. Howard, for the leadership and perspective to bring us in these space and the larger organizers. I think, folks here are concerned with mental health and wellness. And when I think about that in relation to anti-Blackness, I go back to one of the folks who I think did that dance so well, and that's Frantz Fanon. He was a psychiatrist, a revolutionary, assisted in decolonizing efforts in Algeria and other parts of decolonizing parts of Africa. And his job, one of his jobs that really led him to this place of the need for revolution or radicalism, as Dr. Smith is offering, is he was charged with servicing people who were underneath the weight of colonization in Algeria. He was charged with servicing those who were torturing people, the sort of petit police force, the police force who were watching and torturing people in Algeria, and also the Black Algerians who were experiencing the everyday torture. And because he was a good psychiatrist who believed in his training, he knew that to have people who were underneath a condition of torture sit on his couch and try his best to help them feel good about their condition and leave the couch, the only safe space, and go back out into a totalitarian, violent existence. To do that and have them walk away sort of whistling blissfully would actually be malpractice. He was trained that you don't do that, right? And so as a person with domestic violence in my childhood and all this, for folks to say to like my mom or my sisters that, you just need to feel better about the situation, as opposed to transforming the violence of the home that we lived in, right, would be malpractice. And because we do the practice of the work inside schools, and the schools are imbued through and through endemically with systems of violence, I think we should pick up this chance, as Dr. Smith is saying, Dr. Terry alluding to be radical about letting go and abandoning the hope of these structures changing forms, right, from the blood out, from their DNA out, and instead create new structures and enliven new structures that are not embedded and endemically with violence, so that we don't operate with malpractice in our work. So that would be my final word.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I said at the outset that one of the blessings that I have in the work that I do is I get the good fortune to be able to engage with some amazing, and I do mean amazing minds. And you all got to see today just a small glimpse of that. I can't thank Dr. Watson and Dr. Terry and Dr. Smith enough for their brilliance, for their courage, for their bravery, for us all to be better, and to watch them grow and to watch their work continue to have the impact it has is inspiring to me. I'll close with this, and I'm one who believes in alliteration, and I heard Dr. Smith talk about the need to be radical. So let's all go out and be radical. I heard Dr. Terry talk about the rage that exists. We need to understand the rage and where it comes from. And I heard Dr. Watson talk about the need to be revolutionary. So there are 3 R's. They've been just laid down. So as we think about resetting and reimagining schools, do it with rage, do it with a sense of being radical, and do it revolutionary. And I say, let's have some revolutionary love where we begin to fight and advocate and support our children, all of our children first and foremost, but especially those who are most vulnerable. So I want to thank, again, Dr. Watson, Dr. Terry, Dr. Smith. Can we show them some Zoom love in the chat and just let them know how much we appreciate their contributions and their intellect? Thank you all. I'll pass it back over to Kanchi. Y'all got me fired up. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Wow. You got me fired up too. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was such powerful knowledge. And the work that you do is so appreciated. So thank you, Dr. Smith, Dr. Watson, Dr. Terry, and Dr. Howard for having this really important conversation with us today. There was a lot of great information and a lot of appreciation in the chat. So thank you for sharing all these great suggestions, these strategies. And I think what I'm left with is action. Knowledge is great. We got to take action, right, Dr. Howard? So thank you for reminding us of that. Conversations are great, but we got to take action. And I don't know if Dr. Duardo, did you want to say something before we wrap up?
I'm just in awe, a great appreciation and gratitude to all of the presenters. This is tremendous information, something that we all need to continue to hear and to learn and to grow together so we can make sure we're supporting our children and families. And Dr. Howard is just a rock star. What can I tell you? We appreciate him so much. So thank you. I just have a lot of gratitude, and thank you to everybody who's participating, who took the time, because this is learning that's so critical, and we need to continue to have these conversations.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Duardo. So with that, we're going to head into a 5-minute break. But before we do that, I just want to remind folks that in the chat, we have the Symposium program as well as resources that was shared and will be shared throughout the session today. And I forgot to remind people, we are recording this, and at the end of the session, LACO will be sending this out to all the participants. So with that, I'm going to take you to break, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you. We're going to move from one powerful panel discussion to another. For the planning committee, it was really important that we highlight the students that are impacted around racial justice, education equity. And we reached out, LACO helped us reach out, Teen Line helped us reach out, and we got 6 powerfully dynamic students that were willing to step up and be part of this really important conversation and share with us how they've been impacted. So you're going to hear from 2 students, and I'm going to introduce our moderator. He is a child and adolescent and adult psychiatrist within GMH. He's also an emotional wellness program developer and consultant. He is passionate about being impactful in under-resourced and marginalized communities, particularly communities of color, in both his daily work with LA County DMH and various community-oriented projects. He is focused on the intersection of mental health, social and racial justice, and the arts through his initiative, doingitwell.org. I am pleased to introduce our student panel moderator, Dr. Byron Young, and our 2 students, a senior from a high school and a Teen Line volunteer, Rosie Mureo, and a junior from one of our community school sites, Olivia Ramos. Welcome.
Hey everybody, how are you all? Glad to be here. My name is Dr. Byron Young. I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, as I said before. And along with 2 students, I believe it's Rosie and Olivia.
Hi.
Hi. Cool. So this panel is basically designed to keep everyone involved in kind of participating, but also to particularly elevate the voices of our students particularly Rosie and Olivia in this context. And so we've been working together to create some questions that we thought would be fun for us to process, but also for you guys out in the audience. If you look at the screen, we'll be using this software called Mentimeter. So if you go to your web browser, either on your computer or on your phone, and you go to www.menti.com, it will basically have a space for you to enter this 7-digit code, and it will link your phone up with our presentation, with our panel, with our discussion, and it'll allow all the folks out in the audience to interact as well. So not only will we have discussion, but we'll also kind of be having discussion with you digitally, and hopefully at some point have some people even in the audience kind of give their perspectives as well. So if you're having any trouble logging in, let me know. But yeah, just go to www.menti.com. and you can use the code 3486232, and it will make your phone into like a connected remote to the presentation. Before we get started, Olivia and Rosie, would you guys like to introduce yourselves or say anything particularly about who you are and how you came to the space?
Sure. Hi, my name's Olivia Ramos. I'm a junior at Duardo High School. I've been doing a lot of activism within my community, and someone recommended me to join the Symposium, which I was so excited for because I feel like I should have my voice heard, and it's an important time that I could finally share my thoughts with so many educators.
And hi, I'm Rosie. I'm 17 years old, and I'm a rising senior, or a senior now, at John Marshall High School. I volunteer for Teen Line, a teen-led crisis hotline. And I was actually referred to by one of the administration through Teen Line. So I'm really excited to be here as well. And I'm so glad that there's a platform to which we can elevate youth voices.
Cool. Thank you, guys. And so if you're looking at the screen, this is just the one thing we ask. So we want to kind of see who's in the room. And so some of the questions will be kind of just click, your answer, your multiple choice answer question. Some of the questions on the Mentimeter will involve free form, just filling out. If it's a free form, open form question, we'd like everyone for the first thing at the top to put, if you're educator, administrator, provider, parent, student, just to kind of see what voices are saying what. We just figured that'd be an interesting way to engage. And so when you're filling out the open form types of things on Mentimeter, just put that in all caps. Cool. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And so this is our first question, asking how we're feeling. So this is for the whole floor to kind of chime in on Mentimeter, but also for Rosie and Olivia. How are you all doing today?
Nervous.
Nervous? Why so?
I don't know. Kind of a lot of people. I don't know.
I'm feeling pretty empowered. I think that this is such a great opportunity and really unique. So yeah, I'm feeling okay.
Yeah. I'm a little nervous too, just because I hope the technology serves us well. I've done this a bunch of times, but it's always like if the glitch or the internet or whatever. But really excited to hear kind of your perspectives, and I'm really excited that you guys, not only that we're going to talk about this, but that you guys really helped craft the questions, some of the questions that we're gonna talk about. So I feel like that's great, because not only is it interesting to hear what we have to say, and particularly what you have to say, but seeing how the whole group of what people engage with it too. I think that'll be exciting. Looking at the screen, we see folks have all kinds of feelings: excited, inspired, overwhelmed. Let me look at some people are mad, some people are hungry. Okay. So thank you guys for participating. Cool. So this next question asks folks what their role is. So if you're a student, a teacher, a parent, a provider, or other, and this is kind of important for the audience to fill out, because as we ask some of the other questions, if you're a teacher, when you give your answer, like all the teachers' answers will kind of come in a space, all the parents' answers will come in a space, all the providers' answers will come in a space. And so it'd just be interesting to see how we navigate. Like if we ask some of these questions, is there a kind of particular difference in the way that teachers think about this thing versus how providers think about this thing versus how administrators think about this thing? And so, can I also ask, for some of the people who are typing other, could you even put in the chat box what other is, like what you mean when you say other? And if anyone else on our team could let us know some of those responses, that would be great. I'm just curious to know. So it looks like we have a lot of others in the room, so I would really love to hear who those folks are. lot of providers in the room, a lot of administrators in the room. We got students, parents, teachers.
I see others as consultants.
Yeah, I wonder if, what do you guys think? Consultants maybe?
Well, that's what they're typing in the chat.
Oh, you see it, okay. Anything else you see?
It's like school intern.
Yeah, interns.
Okay. Cool.
Social worker.
Okay.
In education. That's cool.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna let you guys go with this one a little bit longer just because I feel like it matters for the next one. Yeah, the reason I didn't want to click the chat to see that, I got a lot of things on my screen and I don't want to mess anything up. But you guys for giving me that info. All right, okay, we'll go now, cool. So this is our first question. COVID-19, particularly things like not just COVID-19, but things like around COVID, like the stay-at-home orders and those types of things, and the social justice issues that we see, like the things that inspire the need for a Black Lives Matter movement, have affected me emotionally and physically. And so this asks you how much, like a strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly agree. For you, Rosie and Olivia, what would you say? Would you say it's been a strongly affected? It strongly affected you, not so strongly? What would you say?
I definitely say strongly agree.
Okay. What about you, Rosie?
Yeah, I would also say strongly agree, only because this is something that no one's really gone through. And so trying to navigate everything that's going on, whether it be like the social climate, but also just like senior year and college apps, is really stressful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the next question we're going to ask for more details for people to explore. Just kind of wanted to see what folks were thinking. We see a pretty spread against strongly agree, and neutral. Like you notice, like for instance, there's like 15% of the administrators say strongly agree, 26% say agree, 19% of the providers versus 20%. I think all of the students seem pretty sure that it's a strongly agree. So, all right, cool. So this next question, and this is one of those open forum questions. So for folks out in the audience, you can kind of say what your role is and then kind of give your perspective. But here, this is like, how has it affected you? And Rosie, you had mentioned as a person trying to graduate, trying to get it together. Could you say a little bit more about that? About how particularly like the nuances of how it's affected you?
Yeah, I think something that I mentioned when we were kind of like just prepping for this is, considering the social climate, like I wanted to do so much. I would consider myself to have a really big impact on my high school campus in terms of being really active and vocal. And because of, the pandemic, I felt really restricted. And so like wanting to go out and protest or just wanting to like kind of just get organized, I felt like I couldn't because there were so many things that were stopping me. So my mom and I found different ways to kind of navigate like my interests and what I was like really leaning towards. So we held the protest, but I stayed in my car the whole time. And so things like that, like finding different outlets and different ways which I can still kind of, show that I'm like involved and spread awareness, but also like personally, like, college apps is really stressful, but I also want to like empower other youth on my campus to really speak on issues that they're really interested in. And so it's kind of just trying to navigate those two things, which can be really stressful, considering virtual learning and stuff like that.
Yeah. Can I ask, when you were doing these college apps, one, how this experience maybe affected how you wrote maybe some of your personal statements, if you mind sharing? Like, did you try to like not let it affect it, or it was unimaginable? Like, I imagine that you couldn't write those things without the tenor.
Yeah, I think I kind of get, okay, so I'm currently in the writing process of my personal statement. And I'm currently going through all of that right now. One thing that a lot of college advisors are saying is not to kind of talk about COVID. It's kind of like you want to be proactive. You don't want to talk about like everything that like COVID has stopped you from doing. So I can talk about like my friends and I, we created an organization called Elderly Essentials. And so that's a like in-home delivery service for those who can't go out because they're, more susceptible to getting the virus and stuff like that. So being proactive and using that kind of, so like adding a little twist to like what I'm writing about, because you definitely don't, like, although it's really important and like unconventional, you can't really shape it in a negative light and be like, well, COVID did all of this and stopped me from doing all of this. You kind of have to, use it to your advantage. And so making up for missed opportunities. So I wanted to start a protest, and that was my first time I got to lead one. And so just kind of highlighting those moments in my essays is something that I would say is very unique, especially for this year, when all the schools are like test optional and stuff.
Yeah. And from the perspective of social justice issues, as a woman of color, has your like realization, or have your thoughts on what it means to be a woman of color, how you navigate the world, or how that might pepper your educational experience, or how it might go into your writing, has that changed since all this, or have you always kind of been there? How would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that I there was definitely a switch that was flipped within everything that was going on. I became more aware of like ethnic studies and how that needed to be implemented within my education. And that's one of the demands that I was asking for within the protest, because I also created a petition. And so those things I really pushed for, because I knew that like my school just wasn't doing everything that I think it need. Like, I don't know. I just don't think that my school was using its power to its full advantage. And I think that they really didn't do a good job at addressing everything that was going on with Black Lives Matter. And so I feel like that kind of was very interpersonal for me, where I was like, well, you know what? I wasn't always comfortable being a person of color, especially being a female person of color. And I wasn't really, comfortable in my own skin. I always looked at it as like the dominant power. I felt like I needed to kind of transform myself so that I can have access to certain opportunities. But just being articulate is something that like is kind of looked at as like a bad thing, because then it's like, well, if you're Latinx, the normal stereotype of being a Latina woman is not being educated, but also being like an immigrant. And so in having those labels kind of just embedded into who I am and trying to like break those down by doing all the work that I'm doing and showing that you can do two sides is very difficult. And I hope that answers your question, but.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing that. Olivia, would you like to give a perspective, particularly in how the things around COVID, how the social justice issues have affected you emotionally, physically, and beyond?
Yeah, so with so much going on, I feel like a lot of times it's so easy for me to get emotionally drained and burned out really quickly. I try to keep active and like educate myself, and sometimes it's hard to like, when you're seeing like so much negative stuff, it takes a toll on my mental health. And I think it's been a learning opportunity on how to like deal with all these different things, from climate change to the Black Lives Matter movement, from just being a better ally. I'm multiracial, so learning how to like be in different communities and be like a good, like know about my heritage, Latinx, then also the Asian community and Filipino. And then also I recently found out I was Native American too, and that has a huge like impact, and I haven't really learned about or like know much about it. So it's just hard to take in all these different things and like ideas at the same time, where sometimes I get burned out and it's stressful.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think, the conversation that just happened around anti-Blackness in schools, and you guys have talked about this, like the social identities in this context matter, right? So like social identities in America come with so much. So your race, your gender, your sexuality, and all these types of things do come with a lot. And particularly when you're already in a marginalized situation, when you have something like COVID-19, the people who are already at the margins are going to be ones who are most greatly affected. And also when you're already at the margins, your education, your water, the way the police treat you, all those things will be kind of damped down. And so I think, Rosie, it was really vulnerable of you to share this notion of like, it's hard navigating if if the kind of standards of excellence all look like this very kind of, I think the term white supremacy kind of is necessary in that there's a thing in America where the things that are valuable have this very white tone, and anything outside of that doesn't have space. And so how do you navigate recognizing your own excellence in a place that tells you that you're not if you don't meet this mark? And then I think Olivia's point about like, one, being a person of color who has your own issues, but also trying to be an ally to other people who may have issues that are a little different, you know? So this notion of like being a good ally as well as trying to handle your own difficulties. I think those things are very, there's a lot of emotionality and a lot of stress that can come with that. And it sounds like, you know, I think you guys both being leaders in your schools and kind of, it says that you're handling these things with style and grace. But I guess maybe before we move on to the next question, and you could even just quickly say, what are some of the things that you guys are doing to rise above the stress of it, the physical and emotional toll? Like, what are the things that you do to kind of cope? What are the things you see your friends doing that are helping you with?
So it's definitely motivated me to, like, I don't know, being 16, it's like, what can I do when I feel like the whole world is like so against everything? And I have to like find what I can do. And so I'm trying to bring ethnic studies to Duardo High School. I think that's a super important step to fight against anti-racism. I'm signed up to be a poll worker, the election poll worker. I think it's super important to keep our democracy alive and to help marginalized communities have their options, especially with the lack of poll workers this year. I've been involved in clubs such as Femme Powered, which is like a feminist club at my school. And I was president of that last year. I've been doing that for like 3 years now. And it's super important to just have a safe like group of like people that you can talk to. One of my favorite things that I'm doing right now is the youth advisory with Planned Parenthood. That I think talking about that and just having that group of people that you share your experiences with to get heard, that was super important for me, and I've really enjoyed doing all those things. So it's really motivated me to get off my butt and stop moping and do all these things.
Cool, thank you. Rosie, would you like to share a few things about how you know, with all this emotional and physical toll that it's taken, how do you rise above it? How do you heal from it? How do you cope with it?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's just educating myself. I think that's knowledge is power. And so if I can educate myself on you know, ways to kind of just spread awareness or be resourceful and kind of just share that, whether it be on like Instagram or social media, anything. Another thing for me, I kind of find peace in like being open and creating dialogue and creating that safe space. Like Olivia mentioned, I think that that's the first step to just being progressive, is having those key conversations. And so I also do Teen Line, and I think that I find comfort in that as well, because I wouldn't say that there's one thing that I do to kind of just bring myself and clear my chakra. I think that I kind of just help others. And so I like knowing that at Teen Line, a crisis-led hotline, for those who don't know, I kind of like knowing that I'm helping someone, and like sitting and being an active listener and being genuinely invested into what's going on kind of allows me to step out of like my shell and step out of my shoes and kind of just think about, well, what works for them and how can we solve this for them, and kind of just take a step back and kind of just reevaluate the scene. I think that's something. I'm also really interested in like meditation. I went on a silent retreat for like 9 days. In a silent retreat, basically you don't get to talk to anyone. You don't get to look at anyone. It's just very introspective. And so I did that, and I do implement that like daily. And so that's something that's really dear to me, is kind of just that moment of like knowing that it's okay to feel joy in a time of national grief. I feel like a lot of my friends, at least, they suffer from like seasonal depression and really bad anxiety and the fear of the unknown. In a time that's very unknown and you really don't know anything or know what's going to happen next. And so kind of just reconnecting with them and checking up on them, but also like being a mentor for them and kind of showing that, you know, there's resources for you and you don't have to go through this alone. And that's kind of how I like feel better during this time, just knowing that I was able to help someone through their day.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're gonna move into the next question. I do want to point out, like, people said so many things, and we appreciate all the folks in the audience participating. Lots of frustration, lots of sadness, lots of like figuring out how to handle things. I do think that one of the things is like this community healing thing that happens when you come to a space and can kind of process and talk amongst each other. I think having dialogue like this is one of the ways in which we heal, but also coming up with solutions. And so I think, you know, I commend everyone for sharing their perspectives, and hopefully we continue as we have this conversation. But thank you guys so much out in the audience for participating. And, you know, we see a lot of things about anxieties and how the intersection of the difficulties from COVID-19, as well as kind of the racial injustice that we experience, how they go hand in hand. And there's some really great articles that came out from the New York Times. I can't remember the writer's name. He's an African-American writer who just wrote all these amazing articles about how people who are already marginalized, particularly Black and brown people, are the folks who feel the brunt of these things the worst. And so I think it's interesting when you add the layer on with education, right? These individuals are experiencing this in a very intense way, and then they still got to go to school. They still got to be parents to people who are going to school. What does that mean, and how do you support, already in a context in which many of those folks had maybe schools that didn't maybe support them even before COVID, didn't maybe support them in the ways in which they felt like they needed. So it's really a complex thing to think about, but really something necessary to think about, and hopefully one of those spaces where we make some change. So this next question asks, how do you think being a person of color impacts students' school experiences with teachers, with administration, with security, with quality of education? And so I think Rosie talked a little bit about this experience, about kind of maybe, and Rosie, I think one of the things you talked about made me think of the term imposter syndrome. So folks talk a lot about when you get to spaces that are like for smart people, or spaces that are for like, you know, the expectations where you're supposed to be, and your social identity has these stereotypes that say maybe you're not supposed to be smart, you're not supposed to, how that like really does affect how you feel in these spaces. So it really made me think about that. And as a person, you know, I went to an African-American kid who went to HBCU and then went to a predominantly white medical school. You know, all these things are things, you know, I've dealt with in my educational trajectory as well. But maybe Olivia, if you could start us off, how do you think being a person of color impacts student school experiences particularly? And that's a broad question purposely, like wherever you'd like to take it.
So I feel like it's such an uphill climb being a person of color in school. There's so much things against you, statistics against you, especially from low-income communities that have not gotten better, and just the way that it's designed, it's all against you. From the school to prison pipeline, and that has been a thing that I've been like researching more about. And I think my school does sometimes participate in that, where it's the alternative schools that you're allowed to go to, and like the disciplinary actions. I think that there is a higher expectation and higher consequences for people of color, and they just get marginalized, where like my school is like primarily it's the Latinx community, and so we get boxed into a group where we stay in our in poverty. It's also hard being a person of color and not getting to know your history. And so I think it was important what they talked about, one of the doctors in the last panel, where he was talking about distinguishing the different communities and seeing their cultures. I don't think that we have done a good enough job teaching about histories. I think that's where it's lacking. It's always been like colonizers' history, white history. And so for me and other people of color, it's not engaging to us because it's not about us, and it's always been Like it's not geared towards us. So I think it lowers participation. And so for the Latinx community, I think there can be more education. Native Americans, the Black community, I think there should be an all-inclusive history, and that's why I think it's so important to have ethnic studies in our high school, or just do a better job of just gearing the whole education to appreciate all cultures without appropriation.
Yeah, there's definitely something clearly this very kind of whitewashed history that like kind of values whiteness and in like the history of European colonial, all these things. Like there is definitely something about that says like, oh, this is what's important, and nothing about where I come from is held here, so it can't be important. And so yeah, that's like really important at a conscious and an unconscious level in terms of like, what do we value? If all the things we learn about are this very Eurocentric thing, then that's what's valued. And then that continues as you go out into the workspace where all the, I talk all the time about going to medical school. When I walked through the hallways of my medical school, it was old white men everywhere. There were no people that represented me. There was no art that looked like the kind of art I like. There was no, I'm saying all the manifestations of what's supposed to be valuable, and like, they play classical music in the hallways. Like what, like hip hop is valuable, right? Like Black art is valuable. Like all these things are just as valuable, but for whatever reason, well, clearly because of anti-Blackness, because of white supremacy and the things that kind of had to exist to, make the country function in ways that it did to exploit folks for economic power and beyond. Like that, people always say this notion of like, well, slavery was so long ago. And then, you could say, oh, well, Jim Crow was so long ago. But like all these things that kind of stem from that are still very present, right? All the disparities that exist for Black and brown people, are still quite great, and in some ways growing even wider. So like all those things come from a place. And so I think having programming in schools, ethnic studies, talking really seriously about racism and about how racism is like not only a health crisis, but also something that is a social crisis, and in this notion of how the impact is. How when you think about things like redlining, and you think about things like gerrymandering and things that get in the way of people's ability to be full humans even today, those discussions must still happen because it's still very alive and present. It's not just like, oh, slavery happened and like, Latinx people were marginalized. They're right now, those things are still very present. And so, yeah, I could imagine it.
And so I'm thankful to be a part of this dual enrollment thing at my school, early college. And so I am taking citrus classes. I'm doing a US history class, which is I like it because it's pretty inclusive of other people's history, that like the impact of slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. And so I think it's so important to educate myself, but so many of the people in the Latinx community and at my school who need this information aren't getting it. And so it's like, I have the opportunity to get this like kind of more inclusive history, whereas a lot of other people from my school aren't getting these, and they have the same history. And it was frustrating to me, where it's like I'm in 11th grade and it's taken me all this time to just learn about my history and the impact of real history that's going on. And so that's why I thought it was so important to bring ethnic studies into the conversation, because it affects people, and it's really impactful. I've been reading statistics that it brings up engagement and GPA in lower communities, and the Bay Area has started the initiative to do it, and so I just want to be a part of that, so yeah.
Rosie, anything you'd like to add before we move on?
Yes, I also just think that within that kind of, because I'm currently taking an ethics class in my school, because that is something that we kind of pushed for this summer. And so this is like the second year I think they're having it. And so I'm really privileged enough to learn about these like tenets of ethnic studies. And something that I think that you hinted at was this kind of just a white supremacy construction of knowledge and how that kind of works. And I think that is something that as a student of color, I often do feel very like tokenized or experience of just tokenism within my, higher like, so not just regular classes, but like my AP classes and how that works. As someone who, you know, goes to a school that does have a lot of resources, but I would say rather than being split up by academic merits, it's split up racially and by ethnic groups. And so we have our 4 small learning communities. And I think that we're kind of going through this period of kind of just internal segregation, because I really do think that we're separated geographically as well. And so the ones who have the most resources are the ones who are kind of considered on the higher level and also happen to be white. And so it's just like, how does that work when I fit into a group to which I'm just as equally motivated and driven to strive for success? But because of this label, I'm very constricted to just limited resources and limited ability to take these other classes. And so some of the kids at my school don't even know that you can cross classes and cross between learning communities to take these higher level classes. And so because I'm very persistent and I'm very vocal, that's something that I brought up, and that's why I'm taking these classes. And I'll go to the full extent of going to the Board of Education and making it happen. But there's some kids who, you know, maybe aren't as vocal, or, you know, don't really want to push for it, or, you know, might be scared because there is a lot of pushback. And so that's kind of just one of my experiences. And I'm very lucky to have a close-knit relationship with my administration, but also, you know, have a parent who's very vocal. Something else that I just wanted to say was, going back to the previous conversation before we started, is kind of the idea of like, we can, like, there's certain things that'll happen to people of color within the school system, but also how do we kind of like provide that same kind of backbone for our teachers and our mentors? I think that the only way we're really going to flourish and kind of just reach that summit and that kind of just plethora of varieties of just things and kind of trainings. And so I think that's something that needs to be implemented is training on how to address racism in the classroom, how to kind of, you know, reconstruct that master narrative or that single story against one ethnic group or one race. How do we kind of create a scene to which, or kind of a course to which, you know, the teacher's open-minded, but also is aware of their personal biases and knows how to navigate through the trauma that some students may not even know they're enduring, like the microaggressions that come up within learning about your history and learning who you are. How do you navigate those? And are there resources for kids who may, you know, be genuinely curious? Like, there's a lot of things that go into this question of like, how do you think a person of color is impacted? It's also just like, yes, I'm impacted, but also like, what about our people of color teachers and administration who, you know, maybe are getting pushback from their higher ups because maybe the higher ups that are at the top are, you know, set around this idea of a master narrative and may also happen to be white. So how do you fix that and then go down all the way to the bottom and eventually create this domino effect, so that, you know, everyone's being progressive and pushing for this general goal? I think that as a student, I can only do so much, and that's why it's so important to have my allies. And I know who I can go to on my campus, but I also want to feel that support from my administration too. And I think that that's something that's lacking. But yeah.
That's a word. I appreciate that. That was really powerful. You know, think about they were talking about like different types of curriculum in the last talk, and this notion of like, as a person of color, as a Black person who is given this curriculum to push on to other people of color, like that must be a wonky feeling if it doesn't align with you and align with your spirit. And so often that is the case. There's great stuff out there, like Dr. Christopher Emden, who's a professor at the Columbia Teachers College, has an amazing book called For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, which is all about this notion of how do you like deconstruct these types of pedagogy and make them like applicable to the kids, to these urban kids that you're teaching. So often it is white teachers in an urban setting teaching kids of color. And they have in their minds this notion of like, there's a standard I want to lift them to, not recognizing that there's so much beauty and value in their own culture. And how do you as a educator engage with culture as a way to connect and educate but also to educate yourself and to be reminded of the value of these people through culture and as you educate them. So they're not people for you to lift up, but for you to come and engage with and kind of have an academic, rigorous tussling of ideas with, right? It's not an elevation of lowly people. It's like, these people are already valuable in their own way. How do you use that value to then kind of educate? So no, I definitely agree. And someone said, I just want to say this, someone said the adultification of Black girls. I really wanted to highlight that. I think that is a huge thing. And there's so much data on that, on the adultification of Black girls, and how like Black girls and boys in non-binary folk are treated, even from a super young age, very different in terms of like, if the Black kid hits another student, it's looked at as like this terrible thing. Whereas if a white kid might hit a student, it's like, oh, well, that's just kids being kids, and how those things like really do matter. And these aren't people who think that they're racist necessarily, but sometimes it's just so innate that it happens. And I think James Baldwin had a quote about how, I'm not saying anybody, I can't tell you if you're racist or not, but I know you won't let me, that the schools that I have are not as good as the schools you have. I know that you won't let me in your unions in the same way. I know that, when your police treat me different than they treat you. So you can call yourself racist or not, but I know the proof is in the pudding and in the data. And there's so much data to support all these disparities that Black and brown folks face when it comes to the academic space. So, thank you guys. So we really have 2 minutes left. So I want to, this is such a good question. Well, let's see if we can get it. Maybe we could talk a little bit about it. I think we have 2 minutes left. But this question asks, who is primarily responsible to make sure that students are learning or getting a meaningful education? And so, yeah, I wonder what folks think. And these questions are purposely kind of like, because some people, it's like a hybrid, I'm sure, in people's minds. But if you had to pick a primary person, who would you pick and why? And so, yeah. And for also, this is another example for people who put other, I'd love for you to type in the chat box what the other is, or maybe what your explanation of it is. Yeah. And, Rosie or Olivia, any perspectives on this? Like, who do you feel like is primarily responsible to make sure that students are getting meaningful education? I know it's a hard question on purpose. Yeah.
It's complex. I think it doesn't fall on one person. It definitely, the student has to want to learn, but it's also about the engagement, and like one of the other doctors was talking about last presentation, how to engage students, and their relationship with students is super important. And so having that teacher-student relationship to want to learn is meaningful, but then also the material that they have to teach is so different. And so like, I think it's the administration's job to give the material flexible, that is representative of different cultures and different experiences, and not just the set curriculum that is in place.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Rosie, would you like to give a perspective on that?
Yeah. Oh boy. When we were going over this question, I was like, how do I even, what? I honestly, I don't think it's one person's job. I think you can't have a system or an institution that's just one. There's only one, it only falls on one person. I think it has to be kind of just united. And so I think that everyone plays a key position, and together they act as one, if that's kind of, and so I would say it's the students to be, engaged, but also like curious, but also the teachers to make sure that they're kind of incorporating a very kind of universal and equal balance type of education, but also the administration knowing that I'm going to support these teachers and I'm going to, provide these resources for the teachers. Because like initially reading this question, I was like, well, it's my job, because I'm not going to rely on my parents to ensure that, I get my education. My mom didn't finish high school. And so the fact that I even want to go to college is something that's highly valued. And so I don't think that I think that it needs to be self-inflicted. And I don't think that I need someone to kind of tell me, hey, you need to be invested into your education. But then again, that's who I am. But also I would see it from like a standpoint of those who maybe don't have the same access or resources that I do. So those who, maybe DACA recipients and don't have parents who speak English, stuff like that, like they need support as well. And so I would understand how, supporting the parents and then supporting the students and then supporting the administration would fall into that. So I think that we kind of just have to work together in order to kind of operate as a unit and be successful.
Yeah. Yes, I know we're running over time, so I'm gonna hand it back over to you, Country. I think that's who's gonna take over, or let me know who's gonna take over. But I think just to add to this, so it is a kind of a trick question. Like, it's everybody's responsibility, and so the notion of like passing it on, like, oh, the parents need to do this, or the teachers need to do this, or whatever. Like, we all got to come together to work, because it's really a systemic thing. Like, anything that would make an unmotivated student, like, what are the systemic things that lead to a kid being unmotivated? Is the kid not motivated for reasons like Olivia said, because I don't see myself in this curriculum, like I'm not represented? Is a parent not motivated because they themselves had trauma from their own racist educational history, and then now, is a teacher not motivated because maybe they're underpaid and they're just like kind of dealing with the pressures from administration? Someone even mentioned in the chat like the notion of like pressures from unions. I didn't even think about that, the notion that a union might play a particular role in how education works. So like, I think it's a really collective thing, and I think again, the way you kind of make it better is to come together like this and have discourse amongst all these people kind of coming together. But I want to say thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you so much, Rosie and Olivia. You guys were awesome. I look forward to next Wednesday when we get to do this all over again.
Yes, Olivia and Rosie, wow, you just inspired me. I have a 5th grader, and to know that you are the students that are speaking up and setting the example for the little ones, it's so inspiring to me. Wow, thank you for sharing your experience, your voice, and advocating for your school community, because that's what it takes. And thank you for speaking up. I'm just so happy you guys were here with us today. And Dr. Young, thank you for modeling this way of engaging, getting our youth involved, like having them creating space where they have a voice, they feel comfortable, because what our students have to offer is mind-blowing. I wish I had a mic so I could drop the mic, but I don't have a mic. So, I don't know. I don't know all the, the tech stuff. But thank you, Olivia and Rosie. You guys are amazing. And with that, I would like to wrap up our first day. Want to remind all the participants that this was our first session. We have 3 more sessions. Our next session is September 30th from 9 to 12. Please make sure you participate. Mr. Valdez will be here to entertain you. Our next conversation will be with superintendents on how to support educators and school staff's well-being. And another reminder, if you have any questions for our next session, please post it in the chat. And in the chat is the survey. We would love to hear from you. We want to make sure that what we covered today was helpful to you, valuable to you. So please take the survey and give feedback to us. And with that, I will conclude this first session, and just wanted to say, remember to stay healthy, stay well, and stay connected. Thank you.